Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. Today I'm joined by a very special group of guests to talk about a game we've wanted to talk about with great eagerness for some time now, Final Fantasy XVI. Let's go around the horn and say hello to everyone. Dustin Furman wearing that sexy new, what do they call that? The stealth shirt?
The stealth.
Is that a term that is a term of art in shirts, like the stealth shirt?
That was the term
something we made up?
That was the term I thought of when I was entering them into the system to differentiate them from our other shirts.
Nice. So you made that up.
That's a good phrase.
It's the stealth shirt. I don't know.
Yeah, that's good branding.
Yeah, I thought the stealth shirt, we got the stealth shirt, and these are also, as we talked about, the premium shirts, the tri-blend. So they're the stealth premium. So extra little modifiers there, but I'm doing all right today. Can't complain. On my second coffee, feeling good, and just playing a lot of Pikmin 4. But that's not what we're here to talk about. But I'm just casually kind of obsessed with this game now after the last day playing it. I'm like, this is some good shit. So. But I'm good.
Good to see you. Mike is playing it as well, and she's really enjoying it.
Yeah.
Rick Hoeg, welcome back to the show. I haven't seen you in a while, although you were just on with the Dukes not too long ago, so the audience has seen you recently, but I haven't.
I was. Some Microsoft news happening this quarter.
Indeed, some big news. I was glad to see you on there. How's life, man? How you feeling?
I'm doing okay. We're still doing rehab a lot, coming off of the stroke at the end of last year, but I am glad to both have been able to play Final Fantasy XVI, to finish it, and now to talk about it with you all.
Yeah, I'm thrilled about that as well. Man, that Final Fantasy XVI was kind of doing a little bit of a number on my hands, just like God of War did. I'm losing it, I think. And then I got an email from a friend who was saying that the DualSense Edge controller has basically saved his career because now you can use the little paddles, but it's good. That was kind of vaguely sexual.
What was that again, Colin?
Little vaguely sexual,
Yeah.
And Gene Park, Washington Post. How are you today, my friend? Welcome back.
Good. I'm glad that you mentioned your hands hurting, because my hands also fucking hurt in Final Fantasy 16, especially after Final Fantasy mode. Pressing square and triangle a lot, and switching up. I actually switched it up to Type C controls. To have the magic on L1, so it's easier to hold the magic. You can hold the magic as you're comboing, and then if you just feel like unleashing the magic burst, then you just do that and lift it up. But yeah, also the DualSense also helps too, because you do the little, you can just play with it a little bit, So
I'm so lazy when I play games that I almost never go into the alternate control settings, and I wonder how much gold I would find in those if I actually just did that. But I'm always just like, this is the way I guess you wanted me to play it, so I'll try to play it this way. But that actually sounds nice because you have magic on this.
Yeah, I did play it on Type A at first, because I was because I love the developer intended experience, right? I'm always about that. But afterwards, I was like, okay, let me just play around with these other controls and see if I can actually be better at this game, And yeah, lo and behold, it was definitely a lot better. So
it's interesting because Final Fantasy 16 was one of my goal games, because I'm a big fan of the Final Fantasy series, and after my medical incident, my left side is part of what I've been rehabbing this whole time, and I couldn't play action games until maybe about March at all. And Final Fantasy 16 actually proved to be not as complicated as I feared, right? It's not as technical as a Devil May Cry. It's not as robust as one of those, and we can talk about whether that's a good or bad thing in a minute. But my hand actually survived pretty well, and it was the focus of some of my rehabilitation. And so at bare minimum, I'm very thankful to Final Fantasy 16 for driving me through a 60-hour process that got my hand all the way to the end.
I was going to say, did you alert your physical therapist to this? That must be good for you. I mean, right?
So my occupational therapist, who's the one that focuses on my hands, knew that I was playing video games and had that as part of the goal set for what we were trying to achieve. And I started really playing things that I moved around in 3D space with Tears of the Kingdom, which was not altogether easy to navigate because of the way that its submenus work, and using my hands for that. But as we kind of went along on the months, by the time I was about a week away from Final Fantasy 16, I had at least some ability to you do very kind of minute things with my left thumb, which is what you need to navigate 3D spaces. And so the real big thing for Final Fantasy was that it's such a long game and it requires so many long sessions that my hand would get tired. So I can't really play, into the night anymore like I used to.
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to fatigue. Like my right hand is specifically. That's why I was wondering. Like you went down on your left side.
I went down on
like more of a
my stroke was on my right side, so it affected my left.
Right. And so you're feathering more, I guess, on the left side. It would be more dexterity on the right side. I wonder which side would be more difficult. Probably the right side to pick back up if you.
Yeah, I can hit all the buttons just fine. It was for the longest time, it was difficult for me to get my thumb up on top of the left stick. Like it just felt like a mountain. And in all honesty, the PlayStation controller is a lot easier for me to use than the Xbox controller because the Xbox controller tends to have me flick the left trigger more. That when you move the left thumbstick a lot, your left index finger kind of curls in. And it just doesn't take a lot to flick whatever's happening with the left trigger on whatever game you're trying to play over there because it's a bigger kind of handhold. So I was very appreciative of the PlayStation controller for that fact. It's just smaller. But
yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you're back in fighting form, at least in the digital space.
We're getting there. We're getting there. I'm glad to be.
Good. And I'm here. I'm glad to be here with all of you guys to talk about Final Fantasy 16 today. So what I did, for those that listened to the last episode of Defining Duke, or Sacred Cross Defining Duke, where we got together for 3 hours to talk about the Activision stuff, and I'm sure a lot of you listened to that or watched that already, and you'll know that I came up with like these fill in the blanks that I thought would help organize the show, and we ended up not even using all of them because we went for so long, but I thought that they at least forced us to answer specific questions that will give us ways to branch out and talk about everything. So we don't need to rely on these, but I have them, and I do want to go around the horn with number one, because the first one that I sent to everyone was Final Fantasy 16 is blank. And I would love to hear what everyone thinks about this as we begin to talk about it. I will warn everyone, because I know some people like the spoiler-free stuff at the beginning. I don't really like doing that. I just want to get right into everything. So if you haven't beaten the game or care about the spoilers or anything like that, you definitely shouldn't listen beyond this point. We are assuming that you don't care, that you've beaten the game and you're familiar with everything. So Dustin, let's start with you.
Sure.
I want everyone to go around, take your time, I'll go all day, baby. I can go all day about this game. So, say what you need to say. No rush. Final Fantasy 16 is blank.
I wrote Final Fantasy 16 is an awesome game, but it has flaws that I cannot ignore. There's certain instances, I think of games like Tears of the Kingdom this year that is also an awesome game that has flaws that feel more easily ignorable because of the whole experience. And this one is a little different. And I'm not saying trying to compare Tears of the Kingdom to Final Fantasy 16. I'm just trying to compare the way I feel about it, in that I feel like Final Fantasy 16 gets so many things right. It has amazing combat. It has an amazing world. It has an amazing story. It has amazing graphics. I feel like, though, some of the things in between are a little more muddy. Some of the, we're talking about side quests specifically, a big gripe of many people, and also a big gripe of mine. And also just that I wanted the game to be a bit more of an RPG. I think this game really is lacking in terms of its different stat-based approach, whether it's gear or the way your different setups are. There's a lot of different moves and abilities, of course, through the different icons, but those are mostly just different powers, not really how you like stat a character. And there is like gear and basic swords and like basic gear that you can kind of change in and out. But for the most part, even when I was playing, I wasn't even too worried about it. And it seems like almost, obviously you got to upgrade your stuff every once in a while, but it doesn't really seem to be much of an imperative, which I think is in some ways a good thing. But I'm really curious. I didn't get to dive into the Final Fantasy mode at all, but I understand that a lot of that does amp things up quite a bit, where you are playing in a more technical way. But
I would say not really. But
not really. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
My experience has been they're more bullet spongy, and they have one or two attacks that can really, really hit you, but it's mostly the same game.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. So I guess the final thing I'll say, because it's tough because I really do think this game is awesome. I think this is one of the best games of the year. I think this is one of the best games on PlayStation 5 currently, probably one of the best games of the generation for sure. It's just like I said, if I was to talk to someone and recommend this game, there's very distinct things I'd be like, these are things you're going to have to deal with that I personally really found lacking. I think one of the things I said to, I think I either said on Sacred Symbols or Discord or both, where I was saying that Final Fantasy gets all of the big things right, and the things in between, the slower moments. A slow moment doesn't have to be a boring moment, but a lot of times in this game, the slow moments are boring. And so there are times where even in the main quest, aside from doing side quests that are just kind of boring. It's like they added filler and they didn't need to. There's like
those ship engines working, Dustin. The
ship engines was one of those. I'm like, what am I doing? I get it. I get why it's in there, but it just, if you're going to make me do something like that, I would hope that it would be a little more interesting than just going around and collecting stuff. So that's my overall summary. And again, I feel like it's much easier for me to talk about the negatives, but I'm sure we're going to be talking about many of the positives. Some of these boss fights, I've seen already, like Ben and I had a few conversations, but we were having strong arguments about what our favorite moments as far as like the bosses and what we like the best, because it's just truly unlike these boss fights are unlike any boss fight I've ever done in a game. Right. I wouldn't say it's like, I think of like Dark Souls boss fights being super memorable. These are memorable in a totally different way that is purely focused on its like cinematic quality. So
yeah, there's no horror involved in it because it's not a hard game, So
right.
It definitely has a different weight to it.
Right.
Hoeg, let's go to you, my friend. Let's get this answer out here. Where are my documents? Here they are. Final Fantasy XVI is. I needed to read that. Final Fantasy XVI is.
Hey, I respect anybody that's got their notes ready. No, absolutely. Yeah. So I think Dustin kind of stole a little bit of my thunder here, because Final Fantasy XVI is a flawed gem. And one of the things that I'm going to wind up talking about on this episode, I know a lot of, are critiques and very specific things I find to be a little bit half-baked in the game. But I say that only under the auspices of, this is probably going to be my favorite game of the year. I really enjoyed Final Fantasy XVI, but like so many instances that are the most annoying in terms of criticism or just concern about a property, whether it's a movie, a television show, or a video game, it's so achingly close to what I want it to be, whether it's in scope or perfection or however you want to describe it, that its flaws are a little bit more apparent, I think. And when I go to a Final Fantasy game, when I go to an RPG in general, I'm there for story and narrative and world building and character. And they clearly have a lot of time spent on world building, and it's great. It's great world building, except when it's not, right? The political setup at the start is inherently interesting. Yes, it borrows too much from Game of Thrones, right down to living with a hostage ward sibling in Iron Islands / Kingdom, an affable giant helping you out through the story. And
dude, Hodor, I thought that immediately. I'm like, that's the Hodor character.
Oh, yeah. And for sure. Even a magic dog from the north that also follows you along.
Yeah, I must say, it's so funny you say that, Hoeg, because when I first started playing it, I was maybe 5 or 10 hours in at the most, and we first talked about it on the show, maybe not even 10 hours, maybe like 5 hours, and I'm like, I'm not really sure what everyone's talking about with this Game of Thrones shit. Like, because there's like a ward or something, and then as I played more and more of it, I'm like, oh yeah, it's fairly on the nose.
Yeah, no, and they just taking aspects of it, right? And like one of the things that happens with Game of Thrones in the books, at least, I'm not going to talk about the last couple seasons of the TV show. I think that enough has been said about those on the internet. But when it's working, when Game of Thrones is working, all those things, those kingdoms, the way they are operated, the people in them, the reason that Theon's a ward in the north, they all work together to fill the storyline. And I think to some extent, like an iPhone clone game or something, a lot of these things are plucked out and placed in there because Game of Thrones has them, and they don't really make a ton of sense for the story. And one of the ones that jumps out to me is Jill being a ward of the Northern Territories, and your sister character as Clive is really strange positioning for the romantic interest of a 60-hour game, right? It's one of the things where Jill is a Theon fill-in for Game of Thrones, but is a completely different character, a typical Final Fantasy romantic interest by the time the game's over. But it's really weird to have your first information about her being she's like your sister. It's like, okay, that's
Maybe
weird.
it is like Game of Thrones in that way.
Yeah, another bar.
But
That's
Game of
literally
Thrones,
just about incest, you know?
I
Yeah.
mean, and the Lannisters are the bad guys, and you have those kinds of conversations in Game of Thrones with that as a known kind of unnatural relationship.
Good point.
It being a relationship with Jill is just strange, and you kind of forget it halfway through, much like the game forgets all of its Game of Thrones and political setup halfway through. But it's weird. So some of these things just kind of jump out that way, that they're these kind of roads to nowhere in terms of the narrative, right? Like, I really like what they did, except that, like, you think of something like Annabella, right? It's this awesome character who's doing these really bad things to your family, to Rosaria, and then you never kind of understand why exactly. Which leads me to my biggest criticism of the game, which is Ultima. I'm glad to be able to say the word Ultima here in this space. Ultima was a mistake. Okay, so the plot line that they had going with politics and what do these various political powers do with things like dominance and icons is interesting, and that's what they sell you on for the first half. And then, you know, an interdimensional hand comes out of a gate somewhere, and you're led into this, what I think people would say is a typical Final Fantasy plot line of a false god or religion or institutional dependency or whatever you want to call it. But what it does is it takes away the agency of all these characters and all this world building that you've previously gotten to know and be interested in for the first half of the game. So by the time the game is finishing, you've got a Tomes entry for Ultima that says something along the lines of the entity that is responsible for all the trials and tribulations on Valisthea. And it's like, that's the worst possible sentence that you could have for a big, far-ranging story for 60 hours, is this alien god dude is responsible for it all. And it reminds me of this reveal in the Disney Plus television show WandaVision, which you might or might not be familiar with, where it's the song that is probably a little bit more memeable. It was Agatha all along. And it's kind of this, it was Ultima all along, but much like WandaVision, the problem with storytelling that way is it doesn't make a ton of sense. And my microphone just fell down. Sorry about that. It doesn't make a ton of sense, which is like, what was Ultima doing for the first half of the game, right? He's responsible for all this stuff, but it brings up all these questions in the way they tell the story because they're trying to make it more mysterious than it is, right? And I'd be very interested to know who in the heck is talking to Clive during the Night of Flames in the prologue of the game. Like, who is that? Right? Because we're led to believe it's one person who also wears a hood later on, but that doesn't make any sense at all. So who is that? And it's all these kind of mysterious points that bring out the kind of Square Enix Kingdom Hearts-ness of it all.
That's where the Kingdom Hearts tweet came from. That's
Yes.
exactly what you talk about. It's not about like Nomura nonsense or it's so confusing or anything like that. No, that I immediately understood your Kingdom Hearts statement that Hoeg got so much flack for on Twitter because that's what you were talking about. This mystery that they're these Easter eggs or these red herrings that they're leaving that doesn't really go anywhere and it's not really paying off. They're red herrings for the sake of it, right?
Yeah, you've got this kind of Lost style storytelling of, oh, isn't this mysterious? Like, you've got the hooded figure, and then it's a different hooded figure later on in the game. It's just this kind of all melange of muddledness that happens where it mostly makes sense at the end. You're like, okay, the hooded figure is Joshua, except he can't be Joshua in that scene. So what are we talking about? And Annabella is the same way, right? Because Annabella starts her black shields in the middle of the game. They start doing terrible things to bearers. But why? All our main characters say, hey, what is Annabella doing? This isn't the mom I know. Even if she was a little bit mean, this isn't what she would do. And we never get any closure to that plot line at all, because when you tell a storyline that way, things tend to get dropped when you're doing your big reveals and explaining things. So I think Ultima is the reason why you have all this mystery and storytelling backwards at the beginning and first dozen or so hours of the game. And I think that just could have been handled a lot better. But overall, I really enjoyed it. And I even enjoy where the Ultima plotline ends up with. See, a lot of people did comment on my Kingdom Hearts tweet earlier and saying I don't like friendship or things. I actually thought that was handled very well at the end. Mm-hmm. I think they have lines coming from the various people at the hideaway that are said when you're fighting Ultima, and I think that works. I think the conversation that Clive has when the sun is finally rising after Primorgenesis or whatever it's called is really well done, where he's explaining to Ultima how, you know, it's worth living free at the end of the day is a good thing. I think that's all handled really smartly. But the Ultima free will conversation is vastly different from the people and politics and fighting and even magic and ether conversations. And I don't think that they gel terribly well. It's like two games grafted together.
Yeah, I actually agree with the notion that the game simply didn't need actually this much story. I'll get into that later. Like it could have been more focused. However, I don't think it necessarily hurts it, and I'll reserve it for my comments. Gene, let's go to you. Final Fantasy 16 is blank.
I'll be a little bit more positive, and this is why I didn't write down my answers, because I want to make the show a little bit more dynamic, right? So I'll focus on the positive for this top level thing. Final Fantasy 16 is the audio visual experience of 2023. Final Fantasy 16 is one of those games now that I would show to people who have never played video games in the last 20 years and still have their idea of like, ooh, plink plonk, whatever, right? Like your stepmom, Colin, who's like, I didn't know that video games had stories, right? Final Fantasy 16 is among those games, including like The Last of Us or Horizon Forbidden West, that I would show to somebody who'd be like, what are video games? And I'm like, this is what they could be right now. This is it. And I would show like the intro, the amazing 2-hour intro that people love so much because the demo was so effective and it was really, really good. I played that demo back in like March or April, and I was blown away. I was like, this is way better than I expected it to be. And then I played the rest of the game, and then basically what everything Hoeg said it came to pass. But before all that, like I would still show the icon fights. I would still show some of the fights between Hugo and Clive and the set pieces. The way the music dynamically changes during the fights is so interesting and great. And I mean, the only other game that does it better is Hi-Fi Rush at Xbox, and that's just like a different tier of like audiovisual synchronicity. But with the amount of moving parts that Final Fantasy 16 has, it's still a wonderful achievement.
I think the music,
the soundtrack is incredible.
Yeah,
it is. It's incredible. It is. It's fucking
so
incredible.
Good.
It is.
Yeah. The spectacle of it all paired with the soundtrack and the male choruses just blurring in and like these wonderful melodies by Soken. Some of these fights just brought me to tears. It wasn't the emotional moments that brought me to tears. It was the violence. It was the sheer spectacle. It was the fact that Bahamut was in space and was about to nuke the planet. That shit made me cry because I was like, this is so fucking beautiful. Look at what he's doing. He's casting the Donald Duck spell, you know?
So and that's what the Kingdom Hearts team did.
That was Sura's
If you don't know, Kingdom Hearts cast the most powerful version of Flare. The Donald Duck and Kingdom Hearts cast the most powerful version of Flare, which freaks out Mickey. He's like, oh my God, Donald's going to do it, you know? And then he obliterates, what's his face? I don't know. I forget his name. Dustin, you would know.
Wait, obliterate. I'm trying to remember which one it was.
Yeah. The time that he casts Zeta Flare, and then everyone's like, Donald, no.
That's in 3, right? That's like,
I think so. I don't know.
I can't remember. Dude, the Organization 13 members.
No.
Yeah. Colin's like, no more Kingdom Hearts.
Dude, Donald said, I am become death in that moment. And he was, you know.
Yeah, but the way they framed Bahamut in that scene was just beautiful. I was like the way that the soundtrack just hits and everyone's like, oh, I was just like, it's so corny, but it's so effective. It hits all the right notes.
The soundtrack's incredible. The boss music, like just the boss music, like that it would like crescendo and then fall off and almost have these interludes and stuff.
The chill out sequence of the boss music is something that I have not experienced before in video games. Usually it's all rise, all metal, whatever. And Final Fantasy 16 has this bit that Colin was just referencing in the middle of its big boss fight music, not its icon fights, not its like cinematic fights, just its normal boss fight music that kind of says, all right, let's take it down a notch.
It becomes a little waltz for a little bit, you know?
It's awesome.
It's beautiful. And that's when the game gets its sense of dynamics right, the loud and the soft, right?
Yeah, no, it really
you can see that in the game design with the loudness of the icon fights and what Dustin mentioned in the softness of the in-betweens, the ship engine, the mid side quests, all the other side quests. That's what Final Fantasy 16 is trying to do, this contrast between like light and darkness, right? The loud and the soft, like a Led Zeppelin song, you know.
You gotta have fall to have your rise.
I totally agree with you. I think in a lot of ways people are too hard on the softness of part of the game to.
Well, I mean, I think the engine quest is just not handled very well, and they could have made it more interesting. But yeah, I think one of the notes that I have here is that I actually quite like the side quests. When I'm playing an RPG, I want side quests that are going to inform world or character or both, and I think that every side quest is kind of aimed at explaining some aspect of their world or their character. I'm not saying that it's always super compelling, delivering soup to various people in the hideaway, but I do think that it is well done for those that want to get that better understanding of the world and the characters. And I think that all pays off a lot more towards the end. And I think that the pacing of the side quests is really bad insofar as they drop 36 of them on you like at the last minute.
Yeah, that actually annoyed the shit out of me because I was at the PSN was telling me I was at 97% completion. And then suddenly there's, I think, literally 12 side quests and probably 6 new hunts, which was cool. But we can get into all that. I want to get into the side quests because I wrote down a bunch of side quests that I actually really liked. And I wanted to see what you guys thought of my list.
Yeah. We can talk about side quests. I have plenty to talk about side quests too.
Oh, yeah. So. There's so many of them.
Yeah.
Here's what I said is that Final Fantasy XVI is a triumph. I don't think Final Fantasy XVI is perfect in any way. And any game that I consider like masterful, I don't consider them perfect. I always think of The Last of Us, the original Last of Us. Ellie's AI was woefully broken in The Last of Us. Like, we all knew it. She was running in front of characters, breaking immersion, doing all these kinds of things. It really didn't ruin the game because the game was so good that you could be like, and then they obviously cleaned that up and remastered it. And then it's not really even a problem in PS5. And obviously in part 2, it's different too. But I look at Final Fantasy XVI's shortcomings as being similar to those kinds of shortcomings where I'm like, I don't know that it really matters. Like if any, my common complaint with every game over the last few years that I really, really loved. So going back to Red Dead Redemption 2, Death Stranding, both Horizon games, et cetera, and so on. I'm like, these games are just too long.
Too long.
And Final Fantasy 16 is too long. If that's the worst thing I can say about it, it's just way too long. And I did everything. So I know that was a choice, but that's the way I want to play my Final Fantasy games. And I'm really familiar with Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy games shouldn't be this meaty.
This was a checklist game, Colin.
Yeah, it was. It was definitely informed by Western RPG conventions.
I think you can see the Final Fantasy 14 in it. I mean, like,
definitely. You definitely can. In fact, I started going back and looking because I'm not familiar with Final Fantasy 14. So I went and started watching videos and playthroughs, like just no commentary playthroughs. And I'm like, geez, dude, there's a lot here that's actually from Final Fantasy 14.
The same game almost, yeah.
Yeah, like just like a lot of design quirks, like the way that they signal side quests and it's like, actually, this is the same interface even in a lot of different ways. But here's what I'll say, and this is something I really wanted to underline before I get to anything else, is that I think the visual language of this game is absolutely incredible. And here's what I mean by that is that I would get into fights, especially boss fights, but like just regular fights where I'm like, dude, how many different enemy attacks are in this game that they animated that are like insane? This guy like just casts a spell and then like 5 light beams come out of the air and like all these things trickle down. I'm like, this is fucking insanity. Like, and every enemy has like 5 of these.
And then your dog is doing backflips right in front of the camera. It's like, fuck, I love this.
Dude, during the boss battles, like they would like one of them like calls up these orbs and they just start moving through the space and then they all like blow into these black holes. And I'm like, dude, this is nuts. This is probably the most impressive game from that perspective I have ever seen because, and I think you guys will appreciate this as old school Final Fantasy fans. I think of Final Fantasy VI. There's an enemy in Zozo, which is the town you go to where everyone lies to you in the game. And it's an amazing part of the game. And there's this huge giant enemy and he attacks you with an earthquake spell called Magnitude 8. I don't know if I'm speaking anyone's language here, but and in Final Fantasy VI, they indicate that by the screen just shaking. And then the damage pops up and then you move on. And if you're floating, maybe you don't get damaged or whatever. But this game's like, no, there's a Magnitude 8 style thing. And like the earth splits open and like lightning bolts start striking. And it's basically the visualization of every one of these things we took for granted in old Final Fantasy games brought to life. This game to me feels deeply connected to Final Fantasy IV. And I was saying this on Sacred Symbols since I started playing it. I feel like these games are even in the same, like somehow connected literally to each other. They seem to echo each other so much. And Final Fantasy VI in a way too, like the whole bringing in the idea of Magitech and all that kind of stuff is right out of Final Fantasy VI, although I know that was in Final Fantasy 15 as well.
Well, summons as weapons too, right?
Right, which technically begins in 3, but Rydia really being the first example of a summoner in the entire series in 4. So you're right. And dude, I actually wrote a lot of those things down and I wanted to get into them later, but like the fixation on the moon, right? Like the whole Dragoon thing, the Dragoon that betrays you, the character starting a certain way and then reviving himself and becoming a totally different character halfway through the game. This is all from Final Fantasy IV. even like right on down to Zemus,
Well, they're
who's the bad
playing
guy.
with you, right? I mean, one thing I think we should talk about is that they reference the moon. That's definitely, you're thinking about 4 if you're playing Final Fantasy games. You've got Clive and Cecil definitely as analogs, although I don't think they handled the transition quite as well, and we can talk about that or not at your discretion. And then the airship concept, right? When you're building those engines, when you're building the Enterprise, the thought process you're supposed to have, I think, is, oh, we're building an airship. It's Final Fantasy. And they reference the airships of the Fallen throughout the game, so that's already in your head. And then at the end of the game...
And they call it the Enterprise.
Yeah, it's called the Enterprise.
Which is also from
Never
Final
stops
Fantasy
being
IV.
funny.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, that's from Star Trek. The Enterprise.
It's actually also from Final Fantasy III, to be fair. But yeah, you're right. I'm so glad you noticed this too.
But that's like Tyler and Wade in an old Final Fantasy. I was surprised they weren't Biggs and Wedge, right?
I'm surprised they weren't Biggs and Wedge. I'm surprised. I'm super shocked they weren't Biggs and Wedge. Yeah.
So that's the same kind of concept, but that's the localization deciding that. I think they might be the same in Japanese. I don't know. But
well, I said that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Hoeg. I was just going to say about the Biggs and Wedge thing. It's so funny because Micah was watching me play the beginning, and I'm like, I wonder if that's Biggs and Wedge, and she was like, she had no idea what I was talking about. And then obviously they do name them those different things, and I know that there's like a Star Wars reference there that I don't think they want to make anymore, and all of that. That wasn't quite as obvious, and so on. But so I wanted to just begin by saying, I think that the design language alone, like the visual flair, it's what you said, Gene, where it's like, this is insane. This is so, and I know it doesn't always matter, but it is expensive. Like what they are doing here is expensive, and it is complicated, and it is so worth it. And I think that's what makes the game's length stand out as being subpar, in the sense that there are parts of it that are just not AAA even, where like you feel like there are things that are just ripped out of Final Fantasy XIV and put here. So you're right out of this amazing cutscene. I'm sitting back, I'm enjoying it. And then you're back and you're talking to someone like you're in Fallout. And I'm like, I wonder if you guys even noticed this, because I was saying this on Sacred, is that there are just weird design cuts where, like, when you go and talk to individual characters about story developments, that's the only part of the game with no voice acting. I don't know if you noticed that.
Well,
like,
they voice the first couple words,
right? Like every few paragraphs, and I'm like, was this like to keep them under a word count? Was this because it was stitched later, and you actually literally went into what you had and started sentences you were writing with things you already had? Like, I started seeing the seams of the game, and I didn't really like that, because I think that they put in so much energy. It reminds me a lot of how I feel about Final Fantasy VII Remake, where I'm like, this is so overwhelmingly quality and so good that it's incredible that you did this, but that game is kind of tight and small. In fact, they cut it into 3 parts because they couldn't do the full thing for it. And it almost felt like Final Fantasy XVI deserved just a little bit more. I would have actually liked to see them get another year and maybe even start cutting the game down, refining a few things. Certainly the performance of the game is really unfortunate. The rumor is that the game was never intended to run at 60 frames to begin with, and that was something that was kind of stapled to it later on, which I would believe. And hopefully the PS5 Pro will take care of that, but by that point I will not care at all. But yeah, the homage to the past I really liked. The design language I really liked. And then finally, the gameplay was awesome, and we'll talk about that. I thought the gameplay was just, for a guy like me who's not mega talented at video games, I thought this was perfect. And then the story and the characters are just incredible. But it reminds me a lot of Game of Thrones in the sense that there's this underriding danger. And just like the show, I didn't ever finish the books, and the books I guess are not done anyway, but just like the show, it kind of veers into the space where I'm like, I don't really even give a shit about any of this. The more interpersonal relationship. So Hoeg's point, I kind of agree with. I think in some way, Ultima is a very standard Final Fantasy villain, very much like X-Death or some of these random fucking chuckleheads. Like they're not Sephiroth or Kefka or something.
No, that was my exactly. Yeah. That was my biggest. As Final Fantasy is known for the most iconic villains in video games. Sephiroth is the Darth Vader of video games, right? And then Ultima is just not even close to that.
Yeah, so it doesn't. I think you guys are right in the sense that they almost didn't need that. It could have stayed supernatural, but not angled towards like the god fight. They even have the floating continent at the end, right? Like,
yeah,
it's
and
very,
that's
very
part
funny.
of the airship trick. I mean, like I love every bit of that they do that the whole game. It felt like them telling us that Final Fantasy VII was coming back before announcing it was a remaster. You know, I mean, like that's what it felt like when they're doing all those airship quests. And the side quest for mid is about turning it into an airship. And then you're like, oh no, that doesn't work.
It's I don't think people are going to care. Final Fantasy III is an ancient game and the story doesn't really matter in it, but I'm playing it right now, and there's even a thing, dude, where in the very beginning of the game, you get an airship really early in Final Fantasy III, and then you use it and bomb like a rock with it, and it explodes, and you basically it's like a kamikaze thing, and then the airship's destroyed. And I was like, I wonder if that destroyed airship is supposed to be this. Like, I was starting to connect things like that because it seemed like the game. Final Fantasy games are famously unconnected, and everyone knows that. You have your chocobos and your Moogles and stuff, and I loved the Moogle in this. I thought he was awesome, and it's exactly the way I envisioned them when I first saw them in Final Fantasy VI. It was really cool, but this seemed to be the first one that was interconnected in a way that was very familiar to me, almost like the way Dragon Quest games feel very interconnected, even though they're not. They are literally interconnected in some way, but it just felt more celebratory of Final Fantasy for the first time and really embracing it. But I think it's going to be lost on a ton of people. And I think people really got to play those pixel remasters, man, because I think you're going to see so many things that are going to, if you care, that I think are really going to shine through. But overall, I think Final Fantasy 16 is a triumph. But Hoeg, let's go back to you for the second one here. And I did this on the Sacred Cross Duke so that everyone can go first and everyone can go last. So we're going to go down the line every so often. So Dustin will now go last and we'll go to Hoeg here. I wrote down here number 2. One thing Final Fantasy VI excels at is blank. So I was curious what you think something that you would want to celebrate from Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that you guys have touched on a little bit that I really love that people don't always either look for in video games or give video games credit for is, again, that kind of visual language. And what I'm talking about is not so much the animations or the fights and the boss battles, but the actual way that they do cinematics. Very often when you're playing video games, they come in a little bit late. The music doesn't fully line up. The music just cuts off when you're going between a cinematic and gameplay. And Final Fantasy XVI takes the time to do establishing shots, to do those title cards. I don't know how many times I use sometime later, but it's got to be
Meanwhile. Meanwhile showed up a little too often. It was starting to get a little funny.
A lot of meanwhiles, a lot of sometime laters, a lot of establishing shots of a castle or torchlight or whatever, and all with kind of directorial visual panache, right? Not just this kind of like flat shot, but pan over and see two people that are kind of kicking their feet on the wall, and that's your next scene. And just things that are much more kind of cinematically minded than we're used to in video games. And it really adds a kind of polish to the whole proceeding for me, right? That it feels like it's intentional. It's something that was done deliberately to make certain thoughts go into your head or give you certain feelings that just doesn't happen a lot with video games. And I think Final Fantasy XVI, especially given its length and its 25 hours of cutscenes, is really impressive as to how much of that kind of premiere HBO movie flair that they actually get into a game like this. So I would say that, along with the music, are two of the absolute highlights for me.
Yeah, well said. Man, there's something about the cutscene length I really became to notice, and you said 25 hours. I didn't know that specific number. I started to notice, like, I'm kind of laying back for a while here, almost Kojima-like in some sense. But I was really, with rare exception where you're kind of doing these things that seem to be like B-teamish, like this crew is handling this angle of the story. We need to pad this. We need to do whatever. That stuff aside, I was really blown away by the continuous quality of every aspect of that presentation, whether it was the writing, the voice acting. The only voice actor I actually had a problem with in the game was Mids, because she's so British, but she looks so Japanese. She is the most Japanese ass looking character in this game, but she has like a fucking Downton Abbey kitchen accent. You know,
when she looks like a fucking J-pop star from outer space.
Right, exactly. That was a little that threw me off. But dude, I just love Clive too, and we'll leave that for later. But he's just so. He's I think my favorite protagonist in all Final Fantasy games. I think it's not even close, actually.
Yeah, he's got some Witcher in him, definitely.
Oh yeah, the soft-spokenness and the kind of the workmanship and all that. Yeah, we'll get to that. Let's go to Eugene. One thing that Final Fantasy 16 excels at is blank.
I'll jump off Hoeg's point on the cinematography. I was really, really astounded at how good the cinematography at Final Fantasy 16 was. There was this one scene in the Dalmatian Republic where you're going into an inn, a tavern with your Uncle Byron, and the camera just starts following this random waitress around. And it just tracks her going up the stairs. It's a very quiet scene. It goes up to the stairs, and then you pass by Yote, who goes in, and you find that Joshua's in the same tavern. And I thought that was a really, really interesting. You don't really see that in many video games, let alone a Final Fantasy game. It was very, look, I hate to cite Tarantino, but it definitely reminded me of Tarantino, like the way that the tracking shots worked in Kill Bill. I was really interested in how like how much effort they put into making sure that this whole thing was a little bit interesting to look at for every second. I really appreciated that.
Yeah. So again, it's so funny, man. I had that in my notes, that specific scene too, because it stood out as being so television-esque, like walk and talk style. I don't know. I was really impressed by that too, and seeing the influences from various things kind of seep into Final Fantasy. I think the balance was really perfect there.
The cinematography too, like the way that the edits would work. We can talk about my favorite scene, but my favorite scene was when Clive and Hugo were just yelling at each other, and the way they just bounced back at each other, and then the fact that they both said "now die" at the same fucking time. It was like the hypest fucking moment in the whole game, and I was just astounded by the editing and the way the dialogue was moving, the way the music was building up. Again, everything. When Final Fantasy 16 works, it just fucking works.
Yeah, well said. Dustin, let's go to you.
Yeah.
One thing Final Fantasy 16 excels at is
building its world and making sure the player has everything they need to understand. So the one thing in this game that, every once in a while a game comes along and they add a feature where it's like, man, I wish every game had this. And that's going to be is it the active time lore? Is that what it's officially called when you hit the
active time lore.
Active time lore. So, and it's amazing how extensive this feature is. So it's, first of all, if you're in a cutscene, you're like, who the fuck is that? What are they talking about? Where are they talking about? You just hit that circle pad, or you hit the touchpad button, and then suddenly it's like, oh, you can, a nice little reference, like a little Wikipedia article almost on all the different things of the world. So first of all, that it's immediate and it's available pretty much whenever you need it was so helpful, especially when you're dealing with all these different factions, all these different characters, and then just the world itself and the history there. I found this feature to be so incredibly helpful. Just if you really want to get in and understand all the different factors going on, but it goes further than that. When you get into the later portion of the game, not later portion, but once you get past the early stuff, where specifically when you talk to Colin, our girl, Vivian,
shout out.
Vivian, the different
she's my waifu in this game for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The fact that it has like a character web that's not only a character web, but it also has the timeline where you can see everyone's different relationships, how the characters evolve, who's living, who's dead. And then also a map with a timeline. And then you can go visit the bookkeeper guy, and he has all the Wikipedia articles for everything at once, where you can see. And they do that whole gamify aspect where it's like you want to go and check in, level up, and see all the different articles that you've collected. And as someone that loves to read into the lore of a world, I found this to be so perfect, because sometimes during a game, I want to go and research while I'm playing to get a better understanding, but it's a very risky move to do that, because you risk accidentally seeing a spoiler or something like that, where it's like, it's kind of like this risky situation. You're like, well, I maybe would be enjoying this more if I could just remember this one part or read a little more, but I also don't want to read too much. And so this game perfectly satiates that in a way that isn't going, there's no risk involved. You're not going to accidentally read something that's further in the game. And so
actually, they fucked up. They fixed it, but the active time lore at a few points did spoil the game for.
Shit!
I was going to say they patched it, because one of the things.
Patched it, yeah.
I'm a big time reader. I love lore and all this stuff. I agree that active time lore is very cool, and I love the tome stuff. But they introduced Ultima early in that.
Yeah,
like Ultima's name pops up early.
Yeah. At that point, you didn't know that Ultima was a thing in this game at all. And then you read that and you're like, oh, I guess there's a thing named Ultima in this game. So yeah, they totally fucked up.
I noticed that. Yeah, so they patched that out. That's interesting. I thought that was intentional, perhaps.
Yeah. Huh.
Well, they also spoiled Barnabas' death like a little too early too. Which obviously, of course, he's gonna fucking die. But
Yeah. Still. I did not know that. That's crazy.
I can appreciate like how tricky it is to make sure that like these text entries are popping up at the exact same time. Like I can see how that can
Yeah,
get
no,
messy.
it
So
didn't bother me
I
so
don't think
much.
it's like a huge deal.
Yeah, the
I think
first
my
reference
biggest
to
problem with
Colton's
active time
thralls.
that lore is that it kind of felt like it almost felt like the game kind of relied on it too much.
They leaned on
It's
it a
not
little
huge
bit,
thing.
right? Like that first scene where they're in like the castle in Dalmekia, and I think Benedictus says something about that. Wasn't it the Dalmecs who fought off the Crusaders in the War of the Two Realms or whatever? It's just really amusing if you're not ever going into active time lore, because at that point you don't necessarily even know that button, and it's like, okay, the writing here is ridiculous. Like this is worse than kind of Game of Thrones or trying to figure out what's happening, because that sentence is just funny when you have no context at all. And so I do think they lean on it a little bit, but the one thing that the tomes and the active time lore really proves to me early on is that there's a certain amount of trust you can have that they've thought this stuff through, right? Because at that point, I'm starting to worry about mysteries. There are hooded people. There's magic. Joshua's back, it seems. He's sucking things into his heart. I don't know what I'm looking at. But the fact that they thought about all these various aspects of the different kingdoms is strongly suggestive to me that at bare minimum, there's going to be an answer for this. And at the end of the game, 99% of the stuff has good answers, but there are some kind of lost threads or strands that happen throughout because of doing things backwards, in my opinion. But I love the active time lore, and I would love to see it in more games, but I think it, especially towards the end when you realize how many tabs everything has and how they advance the plots for all the characters as they go, it seems like a lot of work for most game companies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I understand why more game, or well, I'm trying to think if other games have done something like this. I know Destiny has the Grimoire cards or whatever. I think that's what they're called.
That's probably the closest parallel.
Yeah, that's probably the closest parallel. And I imagine that it's just a very tough thing to pull off. And I mean, you even see they screwed up in some parts, but apparently fixed very quickly. But a really neat feature, and that's just one thing. Obviously, this game does many things right, but that's one thing I wanted to make sure we highlighted and praised just for being so well done.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I love it as a reader and enjoyer of world building. It's one of the things I think is the strongest in the game.
World building enjoyer.
World building enjoyer. I'll put it on my Twitter.
I totally agree with what you guys are saying. I think the active time lore is an example of something very expensive and very difficult being done by a studio and for a game that I think deserves that level of recognition as opposed to the more passive codices that you would see in games, because that kind of stuff can get really overwhelming. And I think by delivering it in this way, it just makes a little bit more sense. I always think about the game Control, which I really love Control, and I'm definitely going to play that game again in preparation for Control 2 when it comes out. But man, that game just dumped shit on you. There must have been books of information in that game, just complete novels of shit. And I remember preparing for our Spoilercast back during Sacred Symbol's more nascent days, and I was like overwhelmed. I had no idea what the fuck was going on. And
now there's a game that leans on its outside information even more than Final
in a major way, and it's cool, and I dig that too. But it's not artfully done, and I think that this was very well done. And I like seeing. It's what we always say about, well, what I always say about God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok, where it's like, why are the little things so bad and annoying in this game? Like, this is the stuff you should nail, like your maps and your menus and all this kind of stuff. And you see something like this that's so complicated and so unnecessary. You almost wonder, like, I was looking at Vivian in some sense as a character that was added during development. I think so. The way she, like, there's just like 4 or 5 points where like the game just stops and she just explains the entire political situation as it stands. And that almost sounds like people playing the game and being like, you need to explain the stuff better than. And so it was a little bit disruptive in that way, but I liked it. And that's what I wanted to say about the game, which was one thing Final Fantasy XVI excels at is balance. I think that there's so many side quests, there's so much story, but it never feels overwhelming or like overwrought, where in my opinion, I wasn't Xing through people's dialogue and I wasn't like just skipping things. I was I was listening to everything, even letting it play out, even though you read it quicker. And I liked that there were just these moments of sheer gameplay, and it's building up to these amazing boss fights and these amazing icon fights and all of the rest. And then these slower storytelling beats that reset the game and ground it. I actually thought that balance was really well done. Again, the game is just too long, but it's too long, just literally too long. It's not the balance of one or the other that should have gone or should have not gone. It all should be exactly as it is, just cut off in some way. And probably that would come from getting rid of the bottom third side quest or something that really didn't need to be in the game. And I think that alone would almost fix the problem if you wanted to be a
I think
completionist.
moving the bottom third side quest into the middle and then removing a lot of the middle side quests would have been the better battle, because the bottom side quests are great, but a lot of them didn't need to be at the very end of the world when God is literally in his spaceship about to nuke the entire planet.
That he is.
And then we have to worry about bandits outside the town.
Well, they have such good closure, right? Like they spend the reason they dump all those at you at the end, and I agree with Eugene, I would have done them earlier, is they have all these kind of character closing chapters that they want to do all at once.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, if you haven't played those end of game subquests and you just went straight to the credits, which is the first run I did of Final Fantasy, and it tends to be what I do, is I tend to run straight to the credits and then go back and do the end state World of Ruin type stuff, which they clearly also were evoking with Primogenesis.
Definitely.
But you have such a better feel, in my opinion, for especially Jill and Torgal from their final subquests, that it's almost a shame to miss them going straight to the ending when you get to those goodbye scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I love you, Uncle Byron, and Uncle Byron is one of my favorite characters, but I think we could have dealt with his quest a little bit earlier than when God decided to lift Washington, D.C. out from the earth and live in the White House and say, I'm going to kill everyone.
It is interesting that Twinside does serve that role, and it doesn't really appear in like the first chunk of the game. Yeah. Like you're introduced to the Crystalline Dominion pretty late on.
I guess it's like God lifting up Manhattan up into the sky, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
He's living in the world.
And they have some really great skyboxes with Origin sitting there.
Yeah.
One interstitial thing I wanted to say before we get back into the ad libs here is, and I'm surprised I didn't bring this up earlier because this is actually a vital portion of why I like this game so much, and so I definitely need to bring this up, which is I think the story, like the point of the story, is really, first of all, it's evocative of old Final Fantasy games, going all the way back to the first Final Fantasy game. In fact, I think Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 1 kind of share a similar thing in that Final Fantasy in that Final Fantasy 1. And again, not to spoil, I mean, Final Fantasy 1 is ancient and the story doesn't really matter, but it's about like the cycle of the crystals and how like the crystals continue, like, and then that they have to basically undo them and get rid of them, but that the characters in doing that kind of disappear themselves as well from reality in order to stop the cycle and the harm of the crystals. And 16 is a similar game, but you know what, this game, and I wonder how you guys feel about this. The story invokes Final Fantasy VII to me. Like there's a real avalanche feel, like bombing the reactors and like going after the mountains.
The mother crystals, right? Let's talk about it for a second, because this is one of those areas where I think Ultima gets confused from being introduced in the plotline, right? You get to the end of the game and it's clear, and it was probably clear to you as you're playing the last couple sections, that Ultima wants the mother crystals gone. As it turns out, the mother crystals are other Ultimas, and he puts them all in himself, and okay, great, it's Final Fantasy. But one thing that doesn't quite work is, how did Ultima get you to break those crystals down? Like it combines with a Final Fantasy VII kind of ecological component, which is that once you have all the history, you understand that ether is this kind of resource. Magic is using it up, and that people using it are creating the stuff that's happening on their planet that's bad. And then Ultima using it to such a great extent with the mother crystals is really bad. And Sid figures that out halfway through the game. Now, I think that this is a place where the game does a little bit more telling than showing. Like, Sid just comes up to you one day and is like, the mother crystal's got to go, bro. And you're like, okay, let's go do that then. And then by the time you get to the end of the game, Ultima's like, yes, the mother crystals are gone. I can have the whole Ultima collective and we can get this stuff done. But I don't think they combine super well. And I have questions about how that came to be exactly. And maybe the thesis that you have, that it's Final Fantasy VII times Final Fantasy 1 times some of the other stuff that's happening, is what occurred here. But I do think that it gets a little too muddled for my personal preferences in the way that they are kind of theming out their storyline, because they also have a lot of things to say just in general about politics and slavery and reliance, right? Like, my first note here when we decided to do this was that the game is a reflection on slavery and dependence. And definitely the last speeches, right? Ultima is constantly talking about free will. He thinks that free will is a bad thing. Clive obviously disagrees. But part of what the Akashic become is essentially giving up their free will And Clive's kind of final temptations that you see in like the second to last battle are just let go. This is too tough. Let go. I'll handle things. And if you let go, everything will be great. And Clive resists that with the help of Joshua. And certainly the kind of friendship forged in battle type of notion is what is driving the Final Fantasy XVI protagonists. But it's not just free will and institutions and religion. It's also talking directly about slavery with the bearer stuff. And then also this kind of notion of dependence on convenience, on magic in the game.
Technology.
Well, technology is interesting. Like one of the things I would raise here is that the game itself is you're leaning on convenience, right? You're depending on magic. And the way that we would equate that in our world is generally dependence on technology, except that in Final Fantasy land here, technology is what gets them out of the convenience of magic, right? The thesis in Final Fantasy XVI is that we can survive the Deadlands, we can thrive without the blessings of the crystals if we're smart enough, and we use science and we use botany and we figure things out. So it's interesting in that, yes, I think the closest analog to us is over-reliance on technology, except that can't be what the thesis of the game is directly. And so
Final Fantasy XVI is about how everyone be on their phones.
Yeah.
a little bit.
That's definitely the vibe I got. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because in a way, Hoeg too, I think Final Fantasy 16, because we were saying like it mimics this, it mimics that. In a lot of literal ways, it mimics 6 just because the crystals in 6 are espers and they are in each have an icon, a summon associated with them. So there's that, like you said, the world of ruin and the world of balance and how everything's screwed up when they just start mining so much magitech, and they get into slaves because they go into like another world to basically harvest magicite from these individuals, and Terra ends up being half one of them. I can't remember their names.
Espers.
Espers, right? Oh no, but didn't they have? I guess they were all espers. That's right. Okay, but there was like a different name for that society, but I don't think there is. And then how Gestalt like goes crazy over with all the power and stuff like that, and so there is like a definite connection to 6 too. But for some reason, just it reeked of eco-terrorist avalanche.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that in there.
Yeah,
but I think
going from
really
reactor to reactor.
Yoshi P directly said that the mother crystals are like oil fields.
But what's really interesting,
that's the direct correlation. He says that they are oil fields. They are Shinra factories.
Yeah, no, and you can get that certainly. What's interesting to me about that in the plot is that like when you show up at Sid's hideaway, I don't think he gives you a great pitch for what they're doing. Right? He
just drops it on you.
I want to help dominance. I want to help the branded. I want to help the bearers. And you're just like, nah, I got to go find the murderer of my brother, which is another interesting piece of the story, right? Like, are we meant to watch that prologue and not think that Clive is Ifrit? Like, I don't know what's happening there because they're going to spend 8 hours or 10 hours with you getting to the point where he realizes it. But it's like, who else could it be? How are we supposed to take the language of cinema in the beginning as anything other than it's Clive, right? Like one of the reasons I really love the demo is by the time they're in black and you're hearing the Phoenix die, right? Like, which is really a very effective scene without visuals, is that, okay, so Clive's going to figure this out, that it's him. And then 13 years later, it's like, I got to find my brother's murderer. It's like, wait, hold on, bro. What?
Yeah.
I saw my buddy Reggie stream Final Fantasy 16, and he is the only person I've ever seen get surprised when Clive turns into Ifrit, and he's like, "Whoa, wait, Clive was Ifrit?" it's just the
really
purity
weird
of that reaction. I was like, "Holy shit, dude!"
It's really funny to give that as a reveal.
Yeah, Holly picked up on that. She didn't even see me play the full intro, and then later when there's the come to Jesus moment where he realizes, Holly's like, "Didn't we already know this?" I'm like, yeah, I'm surprised you knew that.
This, right? I mean, like, are we to take it as a kind of disassociative thing? I mean, is that what happens with him? Because we don't ever get a reason why. Clive, how do you not know that you were doing this? Right? It's just I disassociated from it. Is that?
Yeah, it could be the ignorance of not believing that it could be you. Like how could that be me? How could I not know that? Right? Because his experience with like iconic fights is that the people are aware. So I don't know. There's a lot. There are a lot of weird oddities with the plot, but I kind of, and in fact, I think the ATL stuff is kind of so funny because it's so complex. Like Vivian, I never even used Vivian stuff at all, really, because I'm like, I don't know what the hell this is like I'm back in college or something in like a war class, like, in like a war history class.
What's
where you're
funny
like
is they
looking
don't
at a
have.
map.
What's funny about that whole sequence is that they don't have a ton of like really intricate battle movements or changes in position there, which is what I'm expecting, right? When you introduce those videos, I'm like, okay, a whole empire is going down and they're going to swap sides or something. And for the most part, the entire sequence in the second half of the game is these two armies kind of stall out and then the city blows up.
Yeah, it's strange in the sense that I couldn't quite wrap my arms around the holistic view of everything, even with all the information they were giving me, because it felt so complicated at times. I mean, I get and I wrote down a lot of notes too to kind of keep up with things as well. But I thought it was funny. I noticed this specifically. I just think it's just so funny. There was and Micah was laughing. I was like hysterical laughing at this. There was like a thing in the Vivian stuff where it's like important characters or whatever. And then it's like, whatever, the vital characters. And I click on it. And then 3 down is Ambrosia. And then I just go down and I click on it. And it's just his like picture, like the Troglodyte picture of like over the map and like over all this dramatic stuff. And like his information.
He saved the vessel's life.
This is hysterical. He's awesome. I love him. All right, let's get back. Gene, let's stick with you here now. We'll go to you first.
Mm-hmm.
One thing Final Fantasy XVI does poorly is blank.
I would say it is not an obvious opinion, but it's a side quest. And here's why. Final Fantasy has never really been that great about side quests, period. It's not been the strongest suit. Final Fantasy X had weak side quests. Final Fantasy XIII had like almost no side quests.
You didn't like mixing perfume with Aerith in Final Fantasy VII?
Yeah, I mean, even Final Fantasy VII Remake, the side quests weren't that amazing. You're exactly. You're just doing busy work with Aerith in that little flower town, right? And when I think about a good side quest, here's what I think about. I think about CDPR. I'm not talking about Witcher. Of course, Witcher is obviously one of them, right? And is the obvious parallel. I'm thinking about Cyberpunk. And I don't know if how many of you guys played Cyberpunk.
Yeah, platinumed it, loved it.
Yep, there you go. So once I mentioned the side quest Sinner Man, I think everyone's already nodding their head, right? As Colin is. Mm-hmm. You think about what Sinner Man takes you. Sinner Man takes you to places you never thought you would ever go in Cyberpunk, right? It starts out as one thing and it becomes something else, which Final Fantasy XVI does too, right? But it doesn't really take you anywhere, And I guess we can talk about my favorite side quest now, but my favorite side quest was Torgal's side quest because it took you to a completely new area of the map that you never saw before. And that's the one that I'm going to remember the most.
I love Torgal's final side quest.
It took me to some place that I never saw before in the whole game. The rest of the side quests in Final Fantasy XVI, sure, it's not about what the structure is. So many side quests always are about you go here, you talk to that person, you get the thing, you bring it back, or you go here and you fight some monsters. That's great. That's actually honestly fine. And so many other games do that. Even The Witcher fucking does that, right? But the context of what they offer is so different, Obviously, Cyberpunk Cinnamon quest was literally about you go here, you talk to this person, you go here and you talk to this person. But you go into spoilers for Cinnamon and Cyberpunk.
Wait. Should we? Well, all right. No, go ahead. Everyone knows.
Just skip ahead for like 30 seconds or whatever.
Yeah, fast forward.
Like it takes you into a movie theater. It takes you into the stage that you couldn't go into previously. And that's a new area, new characters, a new setting, and that it just stays with you because it was a new, unique experience.
Yeah, there's like two schools of thought, I guess, right? Is like one, and you can feel the difference between the side quests and the different people designing them, and for the intent is like one is to use what you have, like the spaces you have, the people you have, all of that, and then one is to explore other things. And I think that I agree with you that they should have just done all side quests need to exist for their own reasons. Not just to buff out the world, just to buff out the world. Otherwise, who cares?
And, Nier Automata is like my 4th favorite video game of all time.
Wow, that's very specific. Yeah.
Very specific.
It might be mine too. I don't know about 4, but it's definitely in the top 5.
Yeah, it's definitely in the top 5, right? Like it's after like Resident Evil 4, Zelda, and Dark Souls, right?
Dark Souls 1 and Zelda 1.
I guess Tears of the Kingdom is now it.
Tears of the Kingdom.
Okay. But Nier Automata is my 4th favorite game. But it has really shitty side quests that really just doesn't really take you anywhere. It again, it's exactly what you said, Colin. It just uses what it has, So in the side quests in Final Fantasy XVI, they just like they're telling me, oh, you got to go here, and it's like you can see where I'm going, dude. It's really not that far. So if you're a woodsman, you should just go get the wood there.
Now pick
that's
up
your
the
job.
dirt. Get the dirt piles.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
dirt.
and then I don't know if you guys watch Kyle Bozeman's little clip on Final Fantasy 16 and his little rant about the special boy.
No, I didn't see this.
It's really, really funny where he talks about the side quest at the end, where he says, I think Final Fantasy 16 made me too special because by the end of the game, everyone's telling me about their problems and I'm letting them know I'm literally the Messiah. This story is not about you. It's about me, the special boy.
Right.
I don't care if you live or die,
That's true. I mean, it does. In some way, I think I can justify kind of the trivialities of some of the side quests by Clive trying to be like a normal and decent person and being kind of a man of the people, like a mayor-like figure, and absorbing the mantle of Sid, which is cool. And I like the meta of that as well, as Sid is in many Final Fantasy games, going back to the second one. So I could kind of justify it from that perspective, but it does seem like there are some side quests that I was really surprised by. Like I think the side quest where I was like, what was the Karen side quest where they, unless I'm just misinterpreting it, she literally removes a dude's eye, right?
An eye for an eye. Yeah.
Side quest, and right. And it's like, I'm like, holy shit, like that's hardcore. And I liked the whole thing about how it was about how she was kind of selling to both sides. And then she kind of admits that she was kind of just a merchant of war and didn't really have a side at first. And then it ends in this crazy, heinous violence. And you can imagine everyone's just like looking at her like, holy shit, this chick is crazy. I loved that. This show was great.
Exactly. The script in the side quest in Final Fantasy 16 is good. And that's where a lot of people defending the side quests are coming from. It's like, oh, the story is good. And I was able to find out more about his character. Yes, I agree with that. I actually totally agree with that. But just the actual mechanics of where you go is just so dull,
Yeah, no, I'll agree with that. It's going to be based on where your values lie, right? And I think they did a good job writing up characters and scenarios that I wasn't expecting, rather than places or things that I'm doing that I wasn't expecting. And would I rather have both? Absolutely. But I was surprised by how much character and world they got into those little side quests. It was fun to go once Ash was opened and check out the battle arena where they were keeping the bearers and things like that. And it meant something.
That was cool. Yeah.
It meant something back home to your people. And I think those are good bits. But yeah, certainly Clive is an outsized character in the universe by the end of the game. And to some extent, I think the design mandated that, right? Like once you're going to give him all the icons, he has to be somebody that's getting all the icons, right? So I think a lot of the story elements kind of go back on this notion of like, what kind of guy would get all this power, right? How do the chronolists work? It's because, Ultima set up all these things to test the vessel. It's like, all right. I mean, I get that, but it all kind of feeds back in on this. What we want is for you to be able to have all this magic, and it doesn't make sense in the lore that we started up. Yeah,
and I think what you said also about Clive being like the guy and being the guy sucking up all the icons, I think the huge focus on Clive is a little bit of a detriment to the other characters, and I think that's where the criticism of Jill not being like a woman enough or whatever like that in the Kotaku article. I understand that point of view not because Jill is a bad character. She has her own agency. She's a great character. I love Jill, right? Well, I think she doesn't really do much in terms of the action, man. This is an action game.
I think Jill's a little bit wasted, right? Like, I'm not going to go as far as Kotaku. That's not the first time I've said that.
Yeah. But like when you think about her fight with the liquid flame, all she does is really hold back the fire, and that's it, right? And yeah, she's tired or whatever like that. But you can write around her not being tired. You can just make her not tired. That's it.
It's always the writers. Yes, absolutely.
You can just write it in the way. And to be fair, Sid also gets the sideline too. Sid actually doesn't really do that much. Like Ramuh has always been one of my favorite summons, and the fact that I only got to see him kind of just knock out Clive as Ifrit, and that's really about it. And he stabs Typhon, which was fucking fantastic to see. I fucking love Typhon. I can't believe that they added Typhon in, and like what a glow up of a design for Typhon. But that's all he does too. So like Jill isn't the only character that gets kind of sidelined in lieu of Clive. But then you also go back later on in the game when Bahamut and Clive and Joshua are both fighting Bahamut. That's awesome. What a hype moment, right? Probably the best moment in the game. Would have been cool at the end if Clive, Joshua, and Dion and Jill was able to get in on the action, right? Because like what Dion's still conscious as Muhammad and he's still doing shit, right? Why couldn't Jill, even though she voluntarily got her power sucked up too? You can always write around that, and they just didn't do that. So
Yeah, no, I
that's
think-
kind of like the lost opportunity there.
I'd love to like Jill more. And Jill has such an interesting background, right? She's a ward of the Rossfields. Her father was defeated in battle. She finds out she's a dominant, which has that kind of small universe effect of there were so many dominants living together in 860 in Rosalith. But then she gets taken to the Iron Kingdom, and like even her own plot line, right, which is what the Iron Kingdom is like we're going to go.
That's her loyalty mission.
Avenge Jill. Yes, it is her
Mass Effect
loyalty
2
mission. Exactly.
parlance,
Yeah, well said.
But they don't even give her that much to do there. And I would love to have a little bit more bite to her character, right? Like, were you affected at all by being imprisoned for a decade? It doesn't seem like it. And she doesn't speak very much in the various side quests. So I do think that Jill's a missed opportunity, especially when you realize, and I didn't realize it for much longer than probably other people did, that she was intended to be the romantic interest for the lead. So, I mean, I think in terms of negatives for Final Fantasy XVI, I think that they do screw up a little bit with narrative and world building in both being heavy-handed, right? I think we do need to talk about the bearers a little bit, right? I remember going through Sanbreque for the first time and doing the side quests, and the stuff that they have to establish that the bearers are being mistreated is like cartoonishly evil, right? It's like this notion of, oh, the little girl treats it as a pet, and then it dies in stone, and she's not upset about that. She just wants a new one. And like all this stuff that's just like, okay, how did this wind up being the state of the world? Because the bearers are special, right? The bearers have magical powers. It's not ordinarily how you would think of people being treated this way are the ones that could otherwise burn your house down. And they don't really establish that throughout the entire length of the game until you get to kind of like the final level of the 1,000 Tomes, where they tell you a little bit more about the rebellions and the uprisings that happened before like recorded history or before the current calendar. And I think all of that's useful, but while you're playing it at the time, it's this kind of mystery notion of telling a story that I talked about before.
All that stuff could have been told like way earlier to make it a little bit more compelling. And I like the racism, like the overt racism in the Sanbreque area. My favorite part of that part is how the music is just like a droning.
Oh yeah, no,
It's awesome. It sounds like a John Carpenter. It sounds like a John Carpenter movie or something.
Yeah, I was like, what the fuck is going on here? This is a beautiful scene with this magical crystal castle.
Yeah, the castle. That is a stunning sight with the mountain behind and the castle.
And they got a sunset happening.
And as I'm doing the side quest, I'm like, oh, this is Soken's theme of racism. That's what's going on. This is the racism part. This is the part where it's like they go really, really heavy on the. And I liked it. I have no problem with it. I think it's fine. So.
I think it's okay with heavy on the racism.
I think it just needed a little help in understanding that world, because if it comes off as too artificial to the reader, the watcher, the player, then it just kind of breaks down a little bit, the fiction. Mm-hmm. So I do think that they go through that effort later on. And at that point, you've seen enough of the active time lore in the tomes to have a certain amount of trust. But I just wouldn't have told it the story that way. And I would have had a few more scenes of a couple of things. I would have had more on establishing how the institutions, whether it's the empire or the church or whatever, are putting these fears into people's minds and keeping the bearers where they want them in terms of the social oppression, etc. I also would have established better what the blessing of the crystals is, right? Like ultimately it's that people can't live without magic. They can't do anything at all. But I don't feel like there were scenes in the game that really established that people were just completely unable to function without magic. And the problem is that your experience playing the game is at the Hideaway, right? So you're watching people survive without magic the whole game. And so it becomes a little bit unclear, what in the hell are we even fighting for, right? What are the mother crystals doing? What is the blessing of the crystals? Why do people care so much? And why is this such a big deal? Because we are going to take on the eco-terrorist role, and they're going to call you outlaw. And every time you hear the word outlaw when you're playing Final Fantasy XVI, you should read it as terrorist, because they only ever use it in sentences being like, oh my God, you're an outlaw? And it's you're a terrorist. and that's how that should be read for modern audiences, I think. But
they are. I mean, it's very similar to Avalanche, where they are, because they like what they're killing. Like lots of innocent people are dying in all of this, like the complete chaos that is. They've unleashed complete geopolitical chaos on the world.
They show it immediately at the beginning of FF7, right? They're like, oh, do we do this? You know,
they do. They have the bombing of the reactor, and you have the Empire fall apart, and you have the stuff at Twinside. But like none of that is what you did, right? And there's interesting things that are happening there, again, with the kind of the narrative beats, right? The one thing I really don't like about Final Fantasy 16 is that the more you look into these certain questions, the more you realize they don't really have great answers as far as I can tell. So like you think about the battle at Twinside, right? And the crystal defends itself from being destroyed by Dion by turning into the flower. And that doesn't make any sense while you're experiencing it. The tomes do a good job of explaining that it's like Dion's fears about empire and succession and things like that. And so it turns into the empire symbol flower. But why is the crystal defending itself from being destroyed at that point? Right? The crystals want to be destroyed. What is happening there other than a big giant showpiece? And I love a big giant showpiece, but that kind of thing happens. How does the crystal get destroyed in Waloed? Right? You go and you fight Ultima in his brain, and then the crystal blows up. And when you take these kind of little steps away from you, like what are you even doing? Can Ultima always blow up that crystal?
I totally even think about that. Yeah, how did the crystal blow up in Waloed? That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So if Ultima can blow up the crystal, what is your purpose? What are you doing? And
yeah.
How does that work? What does that happen? And the tomes basically are like, crystal fell. We don't know.
Well, would the argument be that by the time they get to Waloed, there's just simply no resistive power anymore to the destruction of the final crystal, like the collective?
But they don't do it. They don't even swing at the heart. Right?
Yeah.
Like they don't even get there. They're in Ultima's brain.
That's true. Yeah.
They're in the Mind Palace, yeah. The one thing interesting about Final Fantasy 16 is that it relied a lot on the Mind Palace trope, where even when Typhon reaches out to you, he's like reaching out to you and like pulling your unconsciousness. When you have your accept the truth moment, that's all happening in Clive's head too. I didn't really mind it, and it's very, very anime, and that's why right when we got to accept the truth, I was like, this is not about Game of Thrones anymore. This is just Final Fantasy. This is a Final Fantasy.
By the way,
game.
shout out to me for naming our episode Imagine Accepting the Truth, which mixes up Accept the Truth with the Limp Bizkit song, The Truth, where they say Imagine Accepting the Truth. And so I was able to fuse those two worlds together very artfully, like only I could.
Only I could.
There's nothing quite like limit breaking by accepting the truth.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Hoeg, I'll consider that your answer for the
I was trying to.
Yeah, the dumb poorly. I appreciate that. So I'm just going to go to Dustin to wrap this one up. Then, Dustin, do you have anything to say? One thing Final Fantasy 16 does poorly is, quote.
Yeah, so I also said side quests like Gene, but I will add a different element to it that you didn't mention, Gene. It's just that I think that part of the problem with the side quests is that a way that they could fix it, and they were already kind of there, but they didn't do it far enough, is that they did make distinctions about certain quests or certain side quests being special with the plus. You know, you're going to get a little something extra. Maybe you're going to get the chocobo. Maybe you're going to get a new unlock for a special sword or something like that.
This is a Final Fantasy 14 convention, right? As I understand.
It is?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely, from FF14.
Yep.
Straight, same UI and everything.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I don't think they explain it in Final Fantasy 16.
No, they don't. That's why
yeah.
I didn't know it. Again, until I watched that footage of Final Fantasy 14, I didn't even know. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it would have been good for them to take it a step further. Maybe you designate like character missions or something like that, because I think it was on Sacred Symbols, Colin, we were saying that I think one of the big issues is that a lot of the early side quests, and I'm not even just saying like the delivering food, I'm well beyond that. A few hours into the game, a lot of the early side quests really are not very interesting.
Go get me some wood.
Yeah, go get wood, go collect sand, whatever. They're not very good. And I would imagine turn off a lot of players to doing side quests, especially because the game is, I don't want to say it's an easy game, but you don't really need to go grind. So
here's 20 wearite for your troubles.
Yeah.
Great, I have 999 wearite now.
It's
That's
fundamentally
the problem, right? Like that's the it's not an RPG problem. I agree with that completely, which is that part of the problem with the side quests is you get rewarded with lore and character, which is enough for me. It's not enough for everybody. That's totally fine. You're supposed to also get rewarded with economy things. And because it's not an RPG, because the swords are basically just going up in numbers, because there isn't a lot of fun things to equip on yourself or party members, obviously, the rewards are non-existent, right? And it's like the exact opposite. I'm playing a game right now called Remnant 2. And like every single thing you find is like, wow, what does this do?
Yeah.
And
is that game difficult?
No, not in the Dark Souls.
Because people are describing it like that, and I want to play it, but I don't feel like it's for me.
It's Souls adjacent, but it's like the easiest Souls game you've ever played.
Oh, okay, cool. Did you play the first one?
Yes.
Did you like it?
Yes. This
cool.
is much better than
I'm going to check that out, I think.
Me too. So I guess what I would have liked to see, because Hoeg, you bring up how you're rewarded with story and lore. I think that happens increasingly towards the end of the game.
Yes.
But that's the thing, is that I think having some kind of distinction of like, these are character side quests. These are, I don't know. It's one thing where you don't want to be like, well, these are the good side quests and these are the ones that we just kind of added as filler. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like I said, I think that including me, it got to a point where midway through the game, I'm like, I'm not doing side quests anymore because I don't find them necessary or rewarding in any way, whether it's story, economy, leveling, whatever. I don't need to do them. And especially for me, I wanted to make sure I was done I was about a week behind everybody else on playing this game. So I wanted to make sure I was done in time to do this. And so I was like, well, I guess I'm going to play through the game and then figure out what side quests are worth doing afterwards. So I think that putting some kind of distinction, like specifically, I know that, Gene, you mentioned about your favorite side quest, so I'll get into mine too. It's the same one. It's that Torgal one was just super awesome. And as a dog lover,
it made me cry, yeah.
Dude, just it's so heart-wrenchingly sad.
It made me cry too.
The Torgal one
was so
is
beautiful.
great.
And it's a fucking dog, So
also,
I have a cat, so it's like I have that connection,
The Torgal one also solves one of the problems that I had early on, which is like, after the 13-year time skip, Sid just rolls out of the fog with Torgal in front of him. And you're like, what? It's my dog.
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, it's your dog. Okay, great. And it's like, well, that's weird. And then Torgal's final side quest is like, he was looking for you for a decade, bro. And it's like, oh, all right. That all works better now with that side quest.
Dude, can I just say thank God they didn't kill Torgal? Because I was waiting for it. I was waiting for it, and I was waiting
so happy
for
you
it.
didn't get to go to Origin. They had so many death flags on that whole crew.
Well, here's the thing.
It's interesting.
That's how you knew everybody wasn't coming back from Origin, because Torgal didn't go. They weren't going to kill off Torgal.
That was my thought.
Kill off everyone who was going to help Ahmed.
And when Torgal howled at the end, I totally. I was crying.
That wrecked me. Yeah,
I think
for sure.
we need to talk about that a little bit, though. Does Clive die in this?
I
think so.
I thought that was the presumption, is that he did.
Oh, no, it's set up to make you think Clive dies. I'm just curious whether Clive dies, because there's a whole lot of subtext that suggests that he doesn't die.
That would be great if he didn't.
I see that, but I feel like that the main text is that he died.
because the star is extinguished, right? Like that has to mean.
Okay, but what does Media have to do with this, right? Like,
I don't know.
I know that Jill reacts to that because that's the star that she wished on, but Jill also stops crying when she sees the sunrise, where in her subquest, she talks about the sun always coming back, like Clive will always come back. Mm-hmm. And there is, of course, the problem that there's a book called Final Fantasy that apparently relays the entire story of the game, and that Clive's final line to Ultima, which I have to believe the Final Fantasy team was waiting on for years and years and years, was, "If this is your fantasy, and let it be your final one." As he freaking kills him.
That is your fantasy, and we shall be his final witness. I fucking love that line. I don't give a shit if it doesn't make any sense or whatever. It actually kind of does, but like I fucking cheered.
Yes,
Ultima has its problems, but the entire sequence, and we can talk more about Ultima more later.
I love that final. I love Origin. I love everything in Origin.
Yeah, Origin was everything that happened in Origin was pretty fucking hype. And that fucking Origin line, so perfect. I love that the Final Fantasy finally said Final Fantasy.
He's got the line. Awesome. I don't have it right, but it certainly pops out of your head. And then, the epilogue. What's it for, other than to suggest that Clive wrote that book, right? It's written by Joshua, who is almost certainly dead. As a part of the attack on Origin.
Yeah,
they had a Temple of Doom style heart explosion thing going on there with him, so I think he's gone. Yeah,
and Clive has a history now of taking on different names. In fact, I think Clive has like 6 names during the game, because he's Clive, he's Wyvern, he's Sid, he's Mythos, he's Logos, he's the Vessel. I mean, he's all sorts of stuff in the game. So I think that there is at least the suggestion that while he's about to turn to stone, he doesn't, and he gets rid of magic, so it's unclear exactly what would kill him in that scene anyway, and that he's the one telling the story at the end. There's a lot of lines in the subquest right at the end of the game that talk about, well, we need somebody to tell what happened here, and we need you to put down your sword and pick up the quill. And
but then he also says at the end, it turns out that Ultima's power was too much for this body after all. So that the Ultima's body was going to make Clive's sexy booby body explode anyways.
Yes, if he doesn't get rid of magic, I think. But I mean, I think
and two, it also suggests that Ultima's plan was never going to fucking work anyways, because Clive was just gonna maybe it would have been just enough for him to cast that one spell to revive the rest of the alien species or whatever like that, and then he would just implode. I don't know. But,
no, it's
that's where the messiness of the story kind of comes in, And there's I don't like. Even if Clive is alive and I recognize all of those threads, I don't like that we have to do all this connective tissue on our own.
I mean, I think it's designed for you to have that.
It would have been nice if we saw Joshua writing something in a book once. That would have been enough for me,
Well, and in terms of putting threads together, Harpocrates also says Joshua is a strong writer. So, I mean, like they have those things in there. I don't think it's designed to be Inception exactly, but I do think that you are supposed to be looking at certain bits of the subtext and saying, well, it certainly could be the case that Clive survives that. And it's a little bit out of nowhere for him to die in that sequence anyway. But that's why I wanted to raise the question, is I think that there's a lot to read into at the end.
Well, I initially thought when I first saw the credits, I also thought that he was dead. But I think I'm on team alive, actually, because I was thinking about too. One of the things, Hoeg, you had mentioned the sunrise aspect, and her kind of looking out and smiling a little bit. But another thing that I saw people talking about, so I wasn't smart enough to think of this. Just want to be clear. The red star that they wish upon at the beginning of the game extinguishing. Some people view that as Clive dying, but I've also seen like that's the star or the magic fulfilling its wish at that moment, and that Clive is alive. The other thing too is that you see him on the beach and his arm is turning to stone, but we've seen other people that had that happen and survive.
Yeah, Sid.
Yeah, Sid. Yeah. So I'm on team alive, but I kind of am with you, Gene, in that in a game that explains so much and does. Right. I get it. There are a lot of stories with a lot of deep lore and a lot of explainer that they leave a little vague at the end. I'm the type of person, I never really like vague endings in general. I feel like they can sometimes come off as lazy. I'm not saying this one's lazy, but I think I would have been more satisfied.
I think if they actually mean for Clive to be the ambivalently alive, I think that's a little lazy. So that's why I prefer that he's dead, because that's just a cleaner, straighter story to me.
Yeah.
So.
What's funny is when he goes to destroy magic and he raises his hand up above his head, I'm like, oh, that's the statue. That is going to be the statue of him. That is the end point of the game. And then he wakes up on the beach and you're like, okay, so that's not it. But yeah, no, they're playing that sad music over it. They're doing all the tricks in the book that he's dying right here. They have Jill cry. I just don't know that I don't think it's as clear as some people have read it to be that it's certain that he's dead. And I think it's interesting. I don't think it matters. That's why I think it's an okay ending. I don't think whether Clive survives or not matters to the overall narrative or the story. So I think it's an acceptable kind of ambiguity. But I certainly don't blame anybody for saying, no, he's the main character. I played for him for 60 hours. You tell me whether he lived or died.
Yeah, I think I was actually going to ask you guys this. I mean, it makes more sense now, but Final Fantasy XVI does strike me as one of those games that could get a sequel, like a direct sequel in the Final Fantasy legacy, whether you think about kind of Final Fantasy VII spin-offs, but maybe more literally Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy... well, I guess Final Fantasy X would be a big deal. Final Fantasy 13 had a trilogy too, although not maybe as well respected. You can almost see them doing more. Do you think that, Gene, that they'll continue this story in some way with the DLC? Or I know they're exploring that after saying that they didn't really want to do that.
I think they're lying that they didn't really want to do that.
Leviathan is
does seem
built
to kind of lie a lot.
right?
So I think that they always plan to have DLC, and they're just like, oh, people like it. I guess we'll have DLC then. Meanwhile, they've been working on it this whole time.
It would surprise the heck out of me if they don't have a Leviathan the Lost DLC.
Exactly.
Already
there's a whole issue of Leviathan, the missing icon, and there's that whole crystal in the back of one of the areas that's just there. And I was like, what the fuck is that? So there's some real interesting things about the world that I think they could explore. I don't know. It'd be cool if they answered the question whether Clive is dead or not. I think he's. I think there's almost no question in my mind that he's dead. I think it makes sense. I mean, they killed. Spoilers for Final Fantasy 15, but that's what happens at the end of that game too.
But Noctis is definitely dead. Noctis is having a Titanic vision of a throne room at the end of that game. I mean, he's dead.
Yeah, he's dead. Yeah. yeah. It's absolutely the Titanic. Welcome, scene.
So let me see here. I'm going through some of these. Like we've already talked about some of these, so we don't really need to get into too many more of the literal questions I have here. I did want to get into gameplay though, and just kind of see what you guys thought of actually playing the game. Dustin, I guess we can go to you first. I feel like the gameplay was really well done. I was really quite enamored with it. It's different. I think that Final Fantasy games have always changed their combat, and I don't think that we should look at it as quite this sacred thing. Like, and I use Dragon Quest as the example of much more consistency. Although it sounds like maybe Dragon Quest 12 will be a little bit different, but we look at that more as a series with a lot of consistency. And I look at Final Fantasy as something that has always changed its combat. And so having single man action oriented combat in a mainline Final Fantasy works totally fine for me. I think it's cool to have the different icons that you can switch through. I must admit that I tried to experiment with all of them. I just kind of went back to the first three you get,
Okay.
Yeah. You use the let's see, I have it written down here. Yeah. I use Phoenix, Garuda, and Ramu. Phoenix kind of for like that power. Garuda's attacks do mega shield damage or like your stagger damage. And so I would love doing that. And then Ramu really had like a little bit of both. And then so I couldn't tell if it was because you get those first, and so you get used to playing in a certain way, and then you just want to keep playing that way. And so deep into the game, I like really went out of my way to try to experiment using other things. And I'm like, I'm not finding the same balance here. I really loved what I found with those first three. So that's what I used. I will say that they get around role-playing games get into balance problems or into potential even trapping player problems when you get stuck in fights that you can't beat. And Final Fantasy 16 therefore removes all of the downside of losing a fight. In fact, I went into several boss fights and just killed myself because you revive with all of your potions.
It's very nice.
You never have to buy potions.
Right, exactly. So it's really, there are brutal Final Fantasy games. Like Final Fantasy VI has some brutal ass dungeons at the end and some optional stuff where it's like, you better save and hope for the best, dude. Like
the cultist tower.
Final Fantasy VI.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Come on, man.
Final Fantasy VI was the one where I used the egg and Ultima spells for everybody. I mean, like that was what Final Fantasy was for a time, was going and figuring out how to break the systems.
Right, using relics and
grinding
all that.
the heck out of it.
Totally. And I like the experience egg and all that. It's so I don't know. I look at 16 as being really, really fun to play, kinetic, action oriented, but people look at it as being not Final Fantasy because it's different. And I reject that completely. Like I just totally reject that as a premise. It's Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They're all really quite different. Some of them change entirely when people, and it bothers me when people say like Final Fantasy is more of a turn-based game. I'm like, Final Fantasy hasn't really been a turn-based game since Final Fantasy 3. I mean, and I mean the Japanese 3. Like what I always say about 4 is an active time battle game. If you leave it on, you're going to die. A true time-based game, a true turn-based game is one in which you leave.
Well,
and it's your turn.
Call it command-based if you'd like, but I mean, it's certainly the case that Final Fantasy has been picking things off of a menu to accomplish things in your battles, and this is not. This is swinging and dodging in a way that is distinct from Final Fantasy 4 and 6 and 7 and 10. I had somebody come on to me on the internet and tell me that 13 was an action game, and 13 is a straight up command-based battle.
Yeah, it is. But I would argue that 12 and 13, I think, pardon the pun, break the paradigm, I think, for the first time of
12
the way Final Fantasy games function. Because the thing about it's like Final Fantasy 1 has classes that you choose in the beginning. Final Fantasy 2 kind of steals you in these characters. Final Fantasy 3 has this mega dynamic class system. And then Final Fantasy 4 expands to 5 playable characters, active time battle, locked classes. Some classes change throughout the fight and so on and so forth. 5 goes back to this really dynamic thing and so on and so forth. And, you get all the way to 7, reducing it down. 8's battle system, I think, was the first truly radically different fighting system in Final Fantasy, in the mainline Final Fantasy games and so on. So I personally reject the idea. I understand what you're saying, but Final Fantasy in some way is always, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest started in the same place, and so did Phantasy Star. And they've, one or two of them really, one of them doesn't really exist anymore. One of them has walked away to a totally different, out with totally different games outlined on its path. So I don't know. I
enjoyed the combat in this game a lot of the time. I think the icon battles actually let me down a little bit. I love the spectacle. I love the audio visual. We talked about that already, but I do think like just wailing on Titan's head is not great gameplay. I don't think that it's...
I love the fight, but that was a little boring.
Yeah, no, I mean
those specific minutes of that fight were a little boring. Yeah,
yeah, sure. That was my recollection. Is that when I played through that sequence, it's huge. I don't like the music in that particular area.
I love the music. Fuck that.
Oh, I hated it too.
We're allowed,
fight,
we're allowed to disagree.
Worst icon fight of the game.
That was a bad. Okay, we'll talk about that more later.
Hey man, I
love the rock music.
I don't think they ever achieved what they did in that prologue, which is Titan versus Shiva, and I was looking forward to that fight like the whole game. It's like, how are we going to fight that mountain man? And it just got really weird, obviously, with like the tentacles and things like that, and he's eating the crystals, and all sorts of stuff is happening with Titan. But then the music was odd, and then it's just mostly just the same combo over and over for like way too long. Like he's just a bullet sponge.
I will say, going back, Colin, to your point about the combat system and how Final Fantasy XVI, just shirks all tradition. I think there's a lot of symbolism in the fact that the final boss's name and the god of this world is Ultima. And here's why. Final Fantasy is absolutely influenced by the video game Ultima. The menu-based systems and everything like that, the class-based systems. And Final Fantasy XVI is about just removing the shackles of that past, of the creator, of the influence of the creator.
I love that.
Which is Ultima, right? So it's like by destroying Ultima, you are finally, Final Fantasy, the world, the characters are finally removing themselves of the pressure of having to be like that original game.
Richard
Ultima.
Garriott in the grave right now. Can't even believe it.
Wow. Yeah, it would have been funny if Ultima's like, oh, actually, my real name is Richard.
Yeah. Dick Ultima.
Call me Dick
Ultima. I think I might have passed out.
That's where like kind of like my appreciation.
I love that analysis. That's awesome.
No, I mean, I think there's definitely that thread of, the crystals are Final Fantasy, right? At a fundamental level, and that you're going and blowing up the crystals in order to lead to a different world. And the Game of Thrones stuff comes on there because there is a whole kind of breaking the wheel aspect.
I mean, Ultima is usually a magic spell. That's what Ultima has always been. So I thought it was fascinating that they decided to name a character Ultima. That means something,
Yeah. Well, I can certainly understand that reading. I think there's a similar reading you can give to Final Fantasy VII Remake about like what fate is and what the people that are making that game are trying to say about Final Fantasy and the shackles of Final Fantasy VII.
Same thing.
But yeah, I still you're not going to convince me that Ultima isn't a mistake in this particular plot line. But I think combat-wise, I was just surprised that it's not a little bit more difficult, that you're not actually doing a lot of different stuff. You say you stuck with the first 3 icons, Colin. I don't blame you. I rotated out every time I got a new one because I wanted to see what the circle button did, honestly, because I thought that was a cool idea that they all did something pretty significantly different. And I enjoyed kind of mixing and matching the various powers and mastering certain of them and putting them on a different shell. Because you could create some interesting things. Like Garuda does have the ability to get you a kind of bonus stagger in the middle there. And so she's useful to have on certain things. And so I would put her with the stuff that causes stagger. And I used a lot of Bahamut. I really enjoyed using both of the flare systems that he had in order to hurt things. So I liked all that, but I do think that you find your combo, you find what you like, and then you can just sit there with it. I don't think there's a lot of change. If I had a complaint, it's that it can get pretty repetitious. I don't think the hunts really added much. I would have liked to have seen the hunts go really weird with what they're asking you to do and what you're trying to do. Maybe having somebody be elevated the whole time and having to Phoenix shift or grab them a lot more. I don't know. But I just don't think that they did much other than be big and have like 1 or 2 extra attacks, and I would have done more with that. But overall, I think certainly when you start playing the game the first dozen hours or even more, like you're pumped about getting into a fight in a way that is not often the case in a Final Fantasy game necessarily. So I think they achieved that, right? Like you're like, okay, show me some goblins. Let's get this done. I got some stuff to show them. And that's cool to have that from a Final Fantasy game where you're like, I am interested in coming in and getting into a fight and showing you what I can do. But I think by the time that you're at the end, it's like, okay, I know what I'm going to do to stagger you, and then I'm going to wail on you, and I'm going to limit break halfway through, and I'm going to wail on you some more. And it just gets very samey because of that stagger system.
Yeah, if you use the later icons, especially Odin, once you get Odin and you figure out how to actually use him, that's just the rest of the game. He just like wipes using Odin just wipes everything off the map, and it becomes ridiculously easy after a while.
I loved it.
It was so easy that my buddy Pat didn't even see Ultima's like final phase because he just melted Ultima so fast. he was juggling like all of these ultimate.
That's
like the Bahamut flare and then the Odin's Zenketsu. It
So
like
you need that level 5
chance,
Zenketsu.
Yeah.
Put in the money, get that level 5 one of that.
Exactly.
You'll do some
level
damage.
5 Zenketsu, just shing, and it's over. It's gone.
It's funny. I barely used any of that stuff. I loved the circle attack, or it was just like the Phoenix shift. I just constantly used that to just stay on top of enemies. And I liked, it was very much like, it's not so much like Materia, maybe more like the Esper system, where I liked mastering things and then being able to kind of mix and match and like shift or, like substitute things in and out. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
So I will say this about you brought up the hunts. Yeah, the hunts were interesting. I like little things like that and organizing, like going after specialized enemies. I don't know what the point of that was other than to pad things out, though, because it didn't seem to be incredibly thoughtful. But I did them all. And one of the things that I wanted to say too, one of the other things that I reject about kind of this Final Fantasy revision is the way the game's presented. And this is so much more compelling than a world map that it's almost strange to me that anyone would want to go back to the old world. Like Final Fantasy VI, like you leave Narsh and you go to southeast of Figaro. It's like, okay, so you're walking over the overworld and going to Figaro. It's like, who gives a shit? Mm-hmm. And you'll get attacked by some enemies, and that's cool. And I loved those games. But this is more, and the games I think that it invokes, in my opinion, this invokes Tales in a major way. Not the older Tales games, but the Tales games when they finally went to 3D, which was, back with Symphonia and the rest. But they are, or actually Trails of Cold Steel is like this too, but where they're the connected spaces that make up the world map, or what you would perceive as being the world map, not in totality. You're not seeing the whole world. You're seeing one path from Rosaria to whatever. You're seeing, one open field between this place and this place. It's not the totality of the world, but it's so much more imaginative that I think that this is so much preferable, in my opinion. So I'd prefer this to an open world any day of the week, like any day of the week.
I love the map design.
Yeah, me too. I like open. I love, again, intellectually love the idea of open worlds, big, vast open worlds, but I don't know that I'm really down to want to explore those anymore very much. I'd rather have you show me very specific things, even if there's a lot of optional content to do, almost like Mass Effect did back in the day, where you weren't really allowed to go very many places at all. Mass Effect just felt very alive and very vibrant by giving you story and character-driven reasons to visit all these places. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that, because I feel like some people were beating Final Fantasy XVI up from what I saw early on, that it lacks that world map cohesion or whatever, and that people kind of miss that feel. And I'm like, what are you missing? I don't understand why you would rather have that than this. Go ahead.
But Mass Effect side effects always took you somewhere new, right? Even the loyalty missions, there was always a brand new dungeon, a brand new puzzle that you never seen before. I even fucking remember Jacob's fucking loyalty mission for whatever reason. He's like the worst character,
I remember
his loyalty mission because it was a new place.
Jack's loyalty mission is the one that always sticks out to me from Mass Effect 2. I guess that would be where you go to like the asylum or whatever, that planet that she was being held on.
I don't mind the map.
Go ahead, Hoeg.
I don't mind the map, but I do think that they missed a beat for the effects of travel. Right? Like in a Final Fantasy Tactics, they use the map, right? But when you go from place to place, there's a chance you can wind up in a random battle. You can do these various things. I think in this game, the one thing that I would complain about is that you can pop over from the Deadlands to Ash and back 100 times, and it's fine. And it's like nothing happened, right? And I think that there needed to be some solve for what used to be the notion of going somewhere, going to a place. And in Final Fantasy world, that would have been, okay, I get a canoe, and then I get a big boat, and then I get an airship or whatever, and I'm gaining access to these various areas. With the way that they did it, it never fully feels like you're traveling as much as you're just picking the next place that you want to go, with only a couple of exceptions. I really like the intro video / departure video for when you pick to go back to Origin, because they have that kind of goodbye scene at the hideaway, and it's a big deal to get there. But for things like Ash, especially, where part of the conversations you have with everybody is how hard it is to get to, it just becomes a button that you press. And I think that more could have been done to make it feel arduous. And maybe you want to avoid that because you don't want people to feel bad about having to go back and forth. But from a world building perspective, I do think something is lost with just bouncing to wherever you want to be.
I totally felt that, but it definitely. I was just like, it's a video game, so whatever. Like, I'm just gonna pretend that it took 2 weeks to get here. In my
I
head.
will say this though, that I think that you're right in the sense that the one thing the game probably misses is that there is like the middle of the wheel is missing. Like I always think about Hyrule in Ocarina of Time, right? Like it's the center of the spoked wheel. And it shoots you in all the different directions, but you kind of have to cross over and cross over and cross over. And it just gives you a sense of space. And so maybe that's what the game's missing, is that it doesn't dump you again, maybe into a more Tales-like, not so modern Tales, but Tales-like world map where you're going to more of these dungeon-like locations, and just giving you that connective tissue would be easier. But I think that quality of life stuff is just sneaking so far into not only role-playing games, but Final Fantasy games specifically, that like playing the Crystal or the Pixel remasters rather, it's like there's quality of life up the wazoo in these games. Like they're not at all like they were back in the day. And it's because people don't go out the patience. So you're running quickly, you can spoof your experience, you can do whatever you want.
Move on the diagonals.
And the diagonal, yeah, the diagonal movement itself is, I don't know. So I do hear what you're saying, but I didn't long. I think the game is so fucking long already that I didn't long for the interstitial travel.
And I'm not sure that random battles are the right answer there. It's just something to stand in for. This is a big deal, right? And the other aspect of the maps that I didn't love, which is just fixed internally on the maps themselves, is that I would love to see a little bit more gradation, right? When you go to the desert, it's just the desert. When you go to Rosaria, it's just Rosaria. There isn't kind of this notion of what I did like about Final Fantasy, which is like, yeah, you're just going to Figaro or whatever, but you're crossing the desert. You're seeing the various things that you have to do to get there. And this loses that a little bit because you're just essentially picking biome number 3. Yeah,
that's fair. I wonder, it's so funny playing a game earlier this year like Forspoken where it's so vertical. And you would think that maybe they would have absorbed more of that. Maybe not, though. We don't want to get too much of the Forspoken stink on Final Fantasy 16. Let's see. I'm looking through my notes here. What else do we want to say? We're not going so long, but I want to begin to wrap up, I guess. I want to say this about side quests, because I never really got to speak about this, I guess, is I wrote down some side quests that I really liked that I thought were funny or interesting. I was curious what you guys thought of this list. First of all, the Blacksmith's Blues ones with Blackthorn. Those were so funny to me because it's like, it comes off as Blackthorn being mega incompetent. And only through like seeing it all the way through its fruition do you realize like this rivalry and this like old town that he's from and this old jewelry maker and all that. And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Goddamn, come on, buddy, you can do it.
Yeah, I know. It's like I didn't like it at first because like, dude, our like armorer is an asshole. He doesn't know what he's doing. Early on, I loved the one What a Bird Wants, where the chocobos are attacking the carriage because it has all these Geshel greens in it, but the guy's like trying to smuggle them. I thought that was cute. Red Letter Day, I thought was a cute one where Sid goes and tries to find the stuff that the courier dropped, like the letter or Clive goes and tries to find Sid's lost letter and all that. I thought that was a cute one.
Is that the only reference to mid before the second time jump?
Yeah, I think so. As far as I remember,
it's one of those characters where it's like, why are you not introduced before the 5-year time jump? And if we can talk about it for just a minute,
sure.
It's another area where I think there's a little bit of clunkiness. What is the 5-year time jump doing in the narrative? I know it allows the Emperor to be born and a little bit older than he might otherwise be, but like one of the problems I have with the 5 years later is that it seems like everything just stopped. Like the reason you have a time jump usually is you establish that things have changed a little bit. The crystal just came down. You just met Ultima. You're figuring things out. It goes to 5 years later. You've got a new hideaway, which I guess is also built in that time frame, and that's really why the 5-year jump exists. But otherwise, history just kind of stopped. Nobody dealt with the crystal. Nothing else has happened since then. You just kind of zoom up into 5 years forward, and then you drop another 4 crystals pretty fast in succession. So, I mean, like, how do you all feel about that second time jump? Because it felt really weird as it happened, and I'm still not sure I like it in the middle.
I agree with you, and I didn't understand what Joshua was doing between that 5 years too, or what Joshua was doing at all.
During the game, right? Like, why the hell is he avoiding Clive for 13 years? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like that he was keeping track of Clive pretty easily. Is like, why don't you just let your fucking brother know that you're around, dude? Like, you know, like I understand that you're like lore hunting for Ultima, which you didn't even fucking find out that much until the end. You know,
dude, Torgal cared way more about Clive than Joshua.
He really did. Yeah, no,
he's looking for him.
It's strange, right? You piece these questions out, and it's like, wait a minute. if he's not some weird, mysterious dominant of fire, what was he doing? Why are you not saying hi? And it's never explained. It's like, what was Joshua's plan?
Joshua is my least favorite character in Final Fantasy 16, which is sad because I like him as a person. I think he's cool. He's a cool dude, but I just don't know what they were doing. I think the whole red herring aspect of Joshua dead or alive was kind of a waste. Didn't really grip me the way the demo promised to.
Yeah, no, I thought the Joshua being alive actually takes away from some of my favorite bits of that demo and the forward momentum at the start of Final Fantasy 16. I thought for a while, after they introduced in the tomes the concept of an edgy, I think is the pronunciation, of the things like Garuda creates with her power, that if Clive can forget that he's Ifrit, that maybe that Joshua isn't actually there and that he's an edgy of Clive somehow. But they never really went into what happened. It was just that he got rescued. And also, there's another group of super secret people that protect the Phoenix and that Clive forgot about until they appear in the story.
The Undying. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
which I don't mind the Undying at all, but it's like, Clive, if you had mentioned that you knew about the Undying at some point earlier than now, I might have had a notion of what the hell was happening in that plot line over there.
I love that character, Yote or whatever, Yote.
Yote,
yeah, she's awesome.
Yote's cool.
Yeah, she's really. I just love.
All the Undying are cool.
Yeah, they're. I just love the. It's like very ambiguous. Like you're trying to read romance into it, in some way, but you almost can't. Like it's just literal by the book kind of squire behavior, and I don't know. I dug that character. Dustin, since Gene brought up, and I'm looking here at my notes, since he brought up the least favorite character, although we'd answer that question, what is your least favorite character in Final Fantasy 16?
I was thinking about this because there wasn't any character that I specifically didn't like. I was like, I don't like this character, but I guess the Titan. What was his actual name?
Hugo?
Yeah, I just was like, dude, you're dumb. You're chasing after you've got fever for this woman that's making you
the Garudussi.
Yeah, the Garudussi. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's just like, dude, you're too stupid to be a some kind of important political figure. And then it capped off with what I think was the least good icon fight in the game with the weird music. And then you're running up his tentacles like you're Sora in Kingdom Hearts fighting one of the Titans or something, which I was trying to figure out what are the parts that the Kingdom Hearts team worked on for this game?
The shitty parts.
Maybe that, and it's ironic, dude, Colin, so ironic because the combat's closest parallel is Kingdom Hearts, I think, in a lot of ways.
Interesting.
In this game.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now, the combat's not what I have a problem with Kingdom Hearts. It's the unsettling nature of everything that's going on in Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah.
That's really the problem for me.
There's also the one icon
trust.
ability where you're like picking up different targets. You know what I mean? That was kind of reminding me of one of Sora's abilities.
Yeah, that's moves like lock on.
I think that's the part that Platinum worked on.
Okay.
Because if you guys played Bayonetta 3, this is what Bayonetta 3 could have felt like if it actually had budget and also a console that actually could run it.
It wasn't stinky.
Yeah, it wasn't stinky. Yeah. So
yeah. So yeah, the Titan guy, he was just, I think, the character that I understood the least, and then, like I said, capped off with a fight that was just okay.
Yeah,
compared
his
to the other ones.
simpiness made his character pretty weak.
I love chopping off his hands. Great moment.
Yeah,
liked the
violent. Very Game of Thrones ish in its violence, actually, as well.
That was my favorite part, the actual one-on-one hand-to-hand fight against Kuka, because that was when you were like the least powerful. That's when you had to like had the most balance. So you only had Ramu, Garuda, and Ifrit and Phoenix. So it just made it was the most exciting fight because it was the only fight that actually felt like an actual proper one-on-one Devil May Cry fight, where it's like I'm fighting against someone with equal strength. The story of it kind of sucked, but I just loved the dialogue that bit between Kuka and Clive about how when Clive said, "You're not the only person who's seen their world fall apart around them," and Kuka just realizing that Clive just owning the fact that he killed Garuda, that was just so hype, and then the fight happened. So
he does
that is my
favorite.
Interesting
little bit of story, which is like, oh, he's after Sid, and then you don't realize that he knows that it's Sid too until they actually have some dialogue, and they're like, oh, you accidentally found the right guy, so here you go, bud.
Yeah, but definitely the worst part about Coca is his whole motivation, because it's just he would just fucking pussy whip. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the only thing
Plus
about
you're on
him.
the pedestal, get your
Yeah.
hands chopped off.
Why did Sid
done.
send him her head? I don't know.
I thought that was especially brutal
Yeah,
for Sid to do. In fact, I didn't
Clive did that, right?
Uh,
no,
either
Sid
way,
did.
Sid
I
won,
was
isn't it?
I thought that part I was like feels like kind of a little crazy for either one of them. So
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Sid and Benedicta knew each other. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of kind of weird little beats in there. But yeah.
Well, I want to stick with you. What is your least favorite character, Hoeg?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways you could take it. My least favorite character is Ultima, insofar as he exists. But I like some of his writing. I like some of the discussions of free will versus non-free will. I like how he finishes off. I love that final battle. I mean, one of the reasons Final Fantasy XVI works so well is I love the finale, right? I don't know that the game earned it that way. I think there's some clunkiness in getting to that point in time, but I love the finale. So that exists. So Ultima is probably my least favorite character, but I could be convinced on Hugo or Benedicta. I think they aren't served very well. Jill I like, but doesn't exist as a character. She's a bit of a blank to me, and I think she could have been so much more. So that bothers, which is a way of answering as only a lawyer can by not giving you an answer at all.
Yeah, fair enough.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I think my answer, I originally wrote, how do you say his name? Getz or Guts? Goats?
Goots.
Goots.
That's
They
annoying.
say OE as ooh.
Ooh, yeah, whatever. He was obnoxious, specifically because he would appear like, and he would sell shit to you, right? And I'm like, I appreciate like you need to be here, kind of like the Resident Evil 4 merchant or something. It's all right, I get it, but why do you selling me these things? And then he would be like, Nan would kill me if I didn't sell. And I'm like, really? Like Nan would kill you if you didn't take 200 gold pieces for this fucking potion? Well, right when I'm about to go fight, some crazy icon. I don't know. He annoyed me, but I also have to say, I really wanted to like this character. I just couldn't. Is Mid, like the voice is so, I don't know where they thought they were going with that voice and that character, but it doesn't work. Maybe it's totally different, reads differently.
Right?
What'd you say?
It's a variation of Sid's accent, right? I mean, like that's why that she's cast in that role.
I suppose so, but why did they have to make her so British when she's so? It's dissonant to me. She's like the most anime looking character in the entire game, basically, and she sounds like I said, she sounds like a Victorian English person.
She's straight out of Final Fantasy 13, right?
Yes, I actually exactly. Not that
I don't mind Mid, but I would have introduced her in the pre-time skip. It's strange to have her just come out and be like, you're reminding yourself who Mid is when they're like reintroducing her after the time jump, because you're like,
I think Guts and Mid also have the worst main quest side quests. Because their quests were main quests. You could not avoid them. But they have such side quest energy. The Mid is the one who's fucking telling you to collect rocks, and fucking Guts has the required side quests where it involves a child pickpocket. Every fucking RPG involves a child pickpocketing you, and it's like when that happened to Guts, I was like, for fuck's sake, man, Guts, get your shit together, And then that whole side quest chain like just stops you in the middle of everything, when you have to like go around the desert and everything like that. I just hated that part. So yeah,
that's where you get to see Zemeckis, though. I love that.
That is true. That is. I'm looking here. Is there anything else that I really wanted to say before we begin to wrap it up? I think. Oh, you know what? I wanted to ask about some people's, I guess, favorite characters. We want to talk about others. I really love Dion. I think that character. That character fucking rules. And the Dragoons have always been very, very fascinating to me since I was a little kid, and specifically Final Fantasy IV, as we knew it too. And for people that don't know, Kain is the Dragoon in Final Fantasy IV, and the jump. So like Dragoons jump and attack, and in that game, when you jump, you just leave. And then like a couple turns later, he just randomly appears and bing, and just like does massive damage and jumps back into line with everyone. And during that, what I think was the demo, although I didn't play the demo, but I think it's within the demo's time.
It's everything before the title card is the demo.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it was within the parameters of that was like the first time you're fighting among the dragoons are on your side, I think, in there, or no, you're fighting one of them and one of them drops down for the first time from like a rooftop, and I'm like, I got goosebumps, dude.
It gives the full music and scans up the building,
right?
Yeah,
and then like fighting them where like you see like the jump comes up and you see like the circle appear and you just like dash away and they come down on top of their spear really hard. I'm like, this is fucking dope, and I loved Dion like just kind of being that role and showing that role, very Kane-like character. And I wasn't crazy about Kane in 4, but I liked him here, and I thought it was very tragic how he accidentally kills his dad, and it's just like it's insane, like really, really crazy shit. And how he kind of comes in at the end and sacrifices himself, I think is maybe a little Porum and Palm, like if you want to draw a Final Fantasy IV reference there as well. But I got to give a shout out to Dion because I really, really loved any characters you guys want to shout out.
I mean, this is so boring, but I love Clive.
Yeah,
I really do. And I know we talked about him a bit earlier, but I just think that the voice actor did such a great job bringing him to life, obviously, and
his hysterical cries are really good for a video game.
Oh, dude!
Yeah,
like when he was yelling for Joshua at the end, I was like, this is like a real panicked cry. Like fucking Ben Starr is like he really knows how to like sell.
That was almost my choice for favorite scene, is when Joshua gives the Phoenix power fully. Is like that is a great scene because they have the visuals of being in the Origin core. You get the Phoenix wings. Joshua dies in your arms. I mean, it's just a really strong scene. Yeah,
and then Clive's just sprouts the wings. It's beautiful. It's perfectly Final Fantasy, you know.
Yeah, no, it looks awesome. But yeah, no, I'm inclined to say Clive as well. I mean, the one issue I have with kind of the weird political eco-terrorist kind of aspects of the game is that early on when Sid tells you to blow up the crystals, part of Clive and Sid's conversation is basically this is going to hurt a lot of people for a long time and ultimately they'll be free, and then Clive is just okay with it. It's like a strange beat for him, and it kind of mirrors the ending of the game a little bit, but the game has this really strong, somewhat Final Fantasy-esque anti-institutional government break the wheel type concept, which is just, I don't care who it hurts. If freedom is the most important value that we can have and we need to go and fight for it. And I do like Clive articulates that much better towards the end of the game, and especially when conversing with Ultima. But early on, it strikes as very kind of anti-authoritarian, anti-institutional in a way that I found a little bit off-putting in the middle of the game. It's like, wait, what's our deal? I mean, are we just straight up anarcho-terrorists? And we are, kind of. We're right, but, you know, the anarcho-terrorists always think they're right. And so that became interesting. But I think Clive, especially by the end, is just really, really strong. He's just a really caring, compassionate character. I mean, I think this is one area where I think it's just a really good idea for Final Fantasy especially, but in games in general, for him to be in his like mid 30s. I mean, he's clearly has a much more kind of mature outlook on things at the back half of the game, and I think that's really nice to see both in writing and in character.
Yeah, well said. I think Clive is definitely my favorite, like I said earlier, protagonist in Final Fantasy, just because I think he's just easily the most fleshed out. There are really dynamic and interesting characters. There are so many characters that I can rattle off that I love, from Edge to
my answer is usually Celis as my favorite Final Fantasy character, and it's the same kind of mature aspect of looking at things. But I agree with you. Clive is very strong.
Yeah, Celis is a great character too, and her the love triangle with Locke, and there's a lot of cool stuff that I wonder if it was represented in 3D and all the trappings of a $200 or $300 million game, if it would be even more impactful. And I just don't know. Like I think about the opera scene, for instance, and I'm like, damn, dude. That would be insanity. That would be completely like the opera. If
the opera house,
if they announced the Final Fantasy VI remake of some sort, or did which I hope they never do. I think fucking up Final Fantasy VI is just too dangerous. But
I mean, I think if they're remaking 6, they're remaking it Octopath style.
I would hope so.
7 style.
But could you imagine just that whole scene with fighting Ultros and I don't know. That would just be really, really cool. But I wanted to let's end with a couple of these questions here. We won't even go off the.
Can I have a character shout out? Real quick?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Or Benedicta Harmon.
Oh yeah,
I thought she left the story a little too early. I thought her character was getting really, really good. It'll be interesting to see a character just grapple with the consequences of no longer having Garuda's favor. She was kind of freaking out about it, and then she just dies, which is too bad because I thought her performance was so memorable. When she yells at Clive, her facial expressions, the animations that they put into her face were so believable. Like I could read what she's thinking by just by looking at her face, and that's just one of the best things about Final Fantasy. Has always been really good at that. Even Final Fantasy X, when you see the CG cutscenes with Tidus and everything, like you can read what he's saying on his face. And I thought Benedicta was a really good example of Final Fantasy continuing that lineage. And it's just really too bad that she left the story early. Again, it's the story is too long, and it's also still moving too fast to let some of these characters grow. I think some of the in between, like I don't know if we needed to fight Hugo twice. I think we could have had just a one-on-one fight with Hugo, and then we could just go into the Titan Lost fight, and that's it. And also with Barnabas at the end, I think Barnabas is actually probably the weakest character, definitely the weakest icon, because he doesn't really do much. You realize that he's just a puppet of Ultima. There's a forced incest thing that's implied about his mom that really doesn't that's really not brought up anytime.
He just
like,
wanted
oh,
a hug.
I'm just like, oh, okay. I guess this guy's just fucking sicko or whatever. I think he starts Joker laughing at the end, which I thought was actually when he started getting good.
Yeah, no, Barnabas
the fight with Odin was fine, but I just think Barnabas itself there was way too much focus on Barnabas and not on Benedicta. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think we could have used a number of those flashback scenes. Interestingly, that flashback when you're going into Care Norvent, where you get Benedicta in bed with Barnabas and they're talking about collecting the dominance, and you don't quite understand anything that's happening in the plot at that point. That particular scene, I did note, was cut out of the demo, right? The demo said there are various things that have been changed in this, and the Care Norvent battle sequence is shown. It's the battle demo. The demo is 2 pieces, and that particular flashback is just made into her looking at the emblem of Waloed and then closing her hand. And so when I played it the first time, I did know it's like whatever this scene showed, they didn't want us to know about it early. And it's interesting to look at that relationship and not have a lot more of the storyline filled out for Barnabas and Waloed. And you also get aspects of this in the tomes, which is like Barnabas is not from around here. He's from the outer continent. And one thing that's entirely unclear for me, even reading every word that I could and playing this game twice, is whether Valisthea is supposed to be the whole planet or not. I mean, like the outer continent exists, so it's not the whole planet, but whether Ultima is from a different planet or just a different land isn't altogether clear.
This is also very Game of Thrones-ish, isn't it? Because Game of Thrones has all this other land that you never hear anything about too, right?
Well, I mean, it's all Game of Thrones insofar as Storm and Ash is Westeros and Essos. That definitely exists. And then there's the other areas in Game of Thrones. And yes, as you start building out the tomes, you get this notion that there's an outer continent that is where Barnabas and his group are from. And then they arrive on Ash and take over. And then they're the ones that also have the savior cult that knows about Ultima and the Circle of Malleus. And all
maybe more DLC potential here.
Well, I mean, there's DLC potential across the board on all this stuff, but probably not after the story, I wouldn't say.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good
since
point.
Clive kills magic.
That's right.
That's another thing about Barnabas. Like you build a whole ship to that's faster than his ship, but he also wants you to catch up to him. So it's like, do we really need all that just for Clive to get owned? Like the only thing Barnabas has going for him is that he just like beats Clive twice. That's the motivation for Clive to and the player to beat him. That's it.
I mean, I think cutting the sea in half was pretty cool.
I mean, that was cool. I get it. Like it feels like they did it for the spectacle of that scene.
All right, let's go around and reflect as we exit, and leave our final thoughts on Final Fantasy 16. Dustin, let's go to you first.
Final thoughts. I want to give a shout out to the scene with Clive and Jill when they're washed up on the beach and they're like, man, these clothes are all wet. I guess we got to take them off, dry them off. And then they're, I like to imagine Clive's being respectful. That's why they're back to back. And then they have this heart to heart. And Jill's like, you know what? I'm going to push my boobs against your back. And that's going to start a whole chain of things. So shout out to that scene there on the beach, just because I thought it was so funny. I just wish it could have. I want to see you as like, well, these clothes are a little wet, aren't they? Might need to, I don't know, dry him off or something. I guess we got to take him off, like
You got to do it as Clive, though. He'd be gruff. And
it would be
very short lines.
Yeah, very respectful. So, but yeah,
you get to see Clive's whole ass in that scene too. It's so great.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 10 out of 10 for that, for sure. But I love that we had this conversation. I hope that people, when they take from this, is that all of us truly did think this game was awesome. We love this game.
I loved it.
And good criticism is usually of the things we like the most. And so this is just I felt like I was waiting for this game so long, for so many years, waiting for this after getting that first trailer and finally having it here. I'm glad that it was just such an awesome experience. And now I just feel sad thinking like, man, how many years is it going to be till Final Fantasy XVII? This is what Colin and I were talking about, Sacred Symbols. Like, don't make a DLC. Don't waste your time on that. Just get right into it.
I would just
start making Final Fantasy XVII, whatever that is, and keep going with this. So, yeah. We'll have to see where this. It's not my game of the year, I don't think, but it's definitely part.
It's a heck of a year. I don't blame anybody for not having them as the game of the year.
Yeah. So, fantastic game. I'm glad that games like this existed. It's a type of game that makes you excited just that you're in the medium.
Hoeg, reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great game. I'm glad it exists, and as a lover of the series, Final Fantasy, I have to say, in terms of my tilt, I was not looking forward to this one as soon as it was revealed to be an action game. And I was very surprised at how much I engaged with it and how much storytelling and character they were able to get into a game like this, even without parties and equipment and loot and things that I was more used to seeing in my RPGs. So I think they did a really good job. And I think to some extent, that's from sheer volume of writing. Like, I did play Final Fantasy XIV, and I do note some of the things that you see in 14 happen in 16, which is that whenever a sentence could be, there's a tree over there, it's a story about the tree, how I feel about the tree, the location of the tree, how the village built up around the tree, and then telling you it's over there. So it's always 7 paragraphs when a sentence could do, but I tend to like it, and I definitely like it more when it's all vocalized like it is in 16. So I enjoyed playing it. I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the narrative. My question marks here and the little bits where you hear me complaining are that I just don't think it fully squared the circle. It didn't dot the I's across the T's as I would have loved. And instead of getting a story that I was really excited about after playing the demo, which is this notion of like, what does geopolitics look like if 6 people on Earth are actually also atom bombs, right? Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with it from a personality wise? How do you organize your society around that? Which you get into a little bit in the tomes, but never becomes the story because Ultima takes over. I didn't get that. And I wish I did, but I enjoyed what I did get out of it. And I ultimately enjoyed, no pun intended, Ultima at the end. I just didn't like that he took over and took away the agency of all the characters that I'd come to otherwise be interested in. But I really loved the game. I enjoyed playing it for a good number of weeks. I immediately played a second run after I beat it the first time. That tells you something, especially when I have all these great other games to play right now. But I just always hope for the best, and I wish it were a little bit more perfect. The other thing I would say is that, especially coming off of Final Fantasy 15, I'm really impressed by the level of quality and, to not put it too terribly well, finishedness that 16 has as compared to 15 and some of the other things we have seen in Square Enix games, right? 16 feels like a full video game. From the tomes to the cinematics to everything else, it feels like, wow, you guys threw all your resources at this. You came out with something that's really great. I would have changed a few things about the story and the way the narrative was told. But other than that, this is why you play video games like this. This is what you want. This is Final Fantasy. It is big. It is awesome. It will give you emotions when that music comes in. By the time you're seeing Phoenix and Ifrit fight in the first 2 hours, you are well in. And that's going to compel you through the next 12, even when it's a little bit slower in parts during that time. And I couldn't love it more, honestly. And I highly recommend it to everybody that's remotely interested in this. Hopefully, if you're remotely interested in this, you're not listening to me right now at the end of 2 hours of spoiling everything about it. But I really love it.
Some people like doing that. The Dagon Moriartys of the world, for instance.
Hey. Hey, Dagon.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Teach their own. Gene, I want to hear your reflections as we close.
Glad Hoeg brought up the writing and how verbose it can get. My friend Pat, who's a huge Final Fantasy XIV nerd, he played every single piece of content and has played it for like thousands of hours, right? He said the main criticism of Final Fantasy 16 is that the side quests are like MMOs. He says it's not even like that because in Final Fantasy 14, none of the side quests are voiced. So you're reading them quickly, and you're just pressing X to kind of go through, and you're going through as fast as you're reading them. In Final Fantasy 16, they voice a lot of it, right? Most of the side quests, and the player habit is to kind of just listen to the voices as they happen, and then you don't realize that you can actually just kind of skip through them. So the side quests are actually a little bit slower than they are in Final Fantasy 14 if you really think about it, until you decide to skip through them. But that being said, I'm glad this game exists. I was so happy. Complete contrast to Hoeg, I was super stoked that they hired the Devil May Cry 5 guy. I think Devil May Cry 5 is one of the top 3 best action games ever made.
Underappreciated, in my opinion, too.
Yeah. I think the people don't. And if you like Final Fantasy 16, go play Devil May Cry 5. It's a lot more complicated. It has more fighting game inputs, which I think we were talking about earlier about how easy Final Fantasy 16 feels in comparison to that, and that's partially and including how it was gentler on our hands, on our old hands, because there's no directional inputs. We're not pressing back forward dash and triangle to do a stinger move. We're just holding R trigger and square to do that, right? And I was just really super excited because Final Fantasy has been chasing the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children dream. They've been wanting to make a game that looks like that movie, and this is about as close as they've ever gotten to doing it. I mean, they wanted to do it in Final Fantasy 13, and that's why they constructed the battle system that way. They wanted to do that with Final Fantasy 15, which is why Final Fantasy 15 it plays the way it does. And now finally, they were able to gather kind of the Avengers of Japanese developers with Platinum, the Kingdom Hearts guys, the Devil May Cry guys, to come in together and create this, like what is one of the most exemplary Japanese role-playing games I think you can possibly make.
So my closing comments here are just that I think that this is the sign of what an unmoored Square Enix can do with its greatest internal developer, and that developer being unmoored from itself from Final Fantasy XIV for a little while, which is of course a cash cow and a dangerous thing to let them kind of go off and try something different and distract them. And I think that it worked out great. I as to Dustin said, I think there's some urgency in my mind for them to go right into Final Fantasy 17. I would get that thing into pre-production, next year and start moving. But I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to stick around for a while. I think they're really pleased with how Final Fantasy 16 sold, which I'm happy to see and you can believe that because Square Enix is so open about games that don't sell well. They have no problem telling you that. So I don't know why they have no problem telling you that, but they're probably the most honest publisher actually in that regard. So if Final Fantasy 16 wasn't selling well, they wouldn't have said so. And
yeah, exactly. They wouldn't have they would have never announced it if they were disappointed.
Right.
So.
And like I said, the attach rate is probably something like 1 in 10. So
yeah, 10%.
That's pretty great. I was also looking at the trophies where like the game's already been beaten by like 35% of the people that have played it. I mean, when you think about how long the game is, how complicated it is, normal people lives, where this might be like a game that they play for many months. I think Final Fantasy 16 is resonating with people deeply, and I'm pleased about that because I think Final Fantasy has to evolve. I talk about Dragon Quest. I love Dragon Quest, and Dragon Quest 11, which I platinumed, would make half of the people that love Final Fantasy want to put a gun barrel in their mouths and shoot themselves with it because it's so fucking long. It is so repetitive. It is what it is. And that is the comfort food of that series going back to the late 80s. But I think Final Fantasy needs to continue to reinvent itself. That's why it was not so offensive. I mean, it kind of sucked at the time, but Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14 even really represent a want to do something different. And so I appreciate that about this game. I think this game is very high quality. It's really fun. I don't think it's difficult. I don't think it's without its problems, but it is my game of the year so far, I think, pretty easily. I do think that there have been some awesome games this year, including Dead Space and Resident Evil, and a few of the indie games that I've played that I really liked, like Bat Boy was awesome, and Gravity Circuit is awesome, and all the rest. But I think that this game has the crown for me right now, and I don't really know what would displace it actually from that, because I'm sure Spider-Man's going to be good and things like that, but I doubt that that's going to be game of the year material for me. But the one thing I wanted to say as I part two is to encourage people, once you feel like you're sold on a game, I really think it's great to just tune out. And I really went into this game without knowing anything. I didn't know anything about this game. I knew who Clive was, like I said. I didn't really know how the game played. I didn't know much about it at all. I just knew that I was sold on it, and that was so pleasant. And so I'm trying to replicate that with as many games as I can. I'm doing that now with Spider-Man, where I know that new trailer came out. I'm like, I'm good.
That trailer showed way too much.
Well, that's the same thing.
Like last time.
Yeah, Chris laments that all the time. He's like, that's exactly what happened with the first Spider-Man.
Yeah, they show way too much, and you know what? They show way too much in the Final Fantasy 16 trailers too. Like Dustin and I were trying to have a blackout, and we watched this stuff, and then I caught up on some of the trailers that they showed. They show way too much in the. They literally showed a fucking scene from the final battle. You know,
dude, that's a classic Square Enix move. I remember Kingdom Hearts 3. They put out a trailer called The Final Battle or something. I was like the final fight or something. I was like, what are you guys doing?
They're so weird.
I didn't see Typhon before when I played it, right? So when the whole Typhon thing was such a shock, like it feels like Typhon was invading from another fucking video game into Final Fantasy, you know, because he's so gross looking and weird, and the music was literally dubstep, and it's just like what is this video game that Clive has found himself into? But they showed Typhon in one of the trailers, so but I didn't see that trailer, so I was so glad that Typhon. That reveal was a complete surprise to me. You know,
those trailers are wild, right? Because they have one that's all about like the War of the Icons. I was like, this one's just a straight up lie. That is not the story of the game.
Yeah, it's good to just. I get like hitting the beats with more casual people or people on the fence, but I really think like tuning out is such a prime choice. And
get to a place where you're looking forward to it, and then you don't need the details.
Yep.
Right, precisely. So I wanted to just shout that out because I was really able to successfully do that with the help of the audience, of course, for not spoiling things for me. Thank you. So yeah, that's our parting thoughts, I guess. Let's go around and say goodbye to everyone. Dustin, goodbye to you. We'll see you on Sacred Symbols. This will go live the day or two before I guess we do Sacred Symbols again. So I'll see you then.
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you. I'm glad we could do this. Like I said, I was a little bit behind, so I didn't know if I was going to be able to make it work out. But I was glad we could do this. Glad to hang out. And good always, of course, to podcast with Hoeg, with Gene. Gene, I'm getting my double dose of Gene this week, which is pretty nice. So, and Colin, I'll podcast with you on Thursday, as always. Mm-hmm. Less special, but still good. It's just less special.
Oh, I understand that.
So, yeah.
I understand. Hoeg, it was good to see you. Thank you for taking the time. I really feel like your game analytics skills are underrated, mostly because people know you or come to you first for your law analysis, which is great, and they should continue to do that. But I love to have you flex your muscles on our show, so thank you for taking the time.
Hey, thank you for asking me to talk about something that isn't law. I always appreciate it myself. So no, this is great. I love Final Fantasy so much. It's my favorite series in video games, and nothing makes me happier than liking this game that I really didn't expect anything from. I had been talking about 2023 and games I was looking forward to, and people would remind me of Final Fantasy 16, and I was always like, yeah, I mean, that comes out too, and I'll get it, certainly, but I wasn't looking forward to it. And it so surprised me, and I'm so happy to be able to have this conversation where, at the end of the day, it's still a hugely high-score game in my head. Like, I loved it so much, and I'm really glad I got to experience it. I hope if you haven't played it that you get to experience it too.
Right on. And then finally, Gene, thank you for taking the time. Good to see you as always. We can find you in the pages of the Washington Post, but so glad to have you analyzing another game with us.
Yeah. I concur with you. I'm really, really impressed with what Hoeg said about the story beats. A lot of the holes that he saw through, I didn't really think about. So really, really happy to have him here. Final Fantasy is also like probably one of my top three franchises. And look, guys, if you're missing the turn-based or old school RPG feeling, there are plenty of games that do that for you. Right now, I'm obsessed with Octopath Traveler. It is hitting all the right buttons for me.
Octopath Traveler 2 is so impressive. It's like the furthest a traditional role-playing game has ever been pushed, I think. It's pretty cool.
You mean part 2?
Yeah, the second one. Yeah, the second.
Yeah. So I want to do what you've talked about, Colin. I want to earn my way to part 2.
So you're playing the first one. Nice.
Yeah, so I'm playing through the first one, and I'm still fucking loving it. So if part 2 is that much better, then I'm in for a fucking great time, And also Xenoblade Chronicles, I think a lot of my disappointment with Final Fantasy 16 is the fact that I played Xenoblade Chronicles back in 2010. And so much of the story beats in Final Fantasy 16 are almost exactly the same in Xenoblade Chronicles, but they do kind of they do really, really interesting things. So I know I push it already on Punching Up a lot, but yeah, guys, play Xenoblade Chronicles. If you like Final Fantasy 16 and you want a story like that again, play Xenoblade Chronicles. I think you're going to be really, really surprised at what they do with the story tropes there.
Micah was playing it and really liked it. So yeah, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I just said it gets weird. No, I really like Xenoblade Chronicles, and certainly JRPGs now for a good long time have been very interested in fighting fate, cutting off the chains of destiny, whatever way you want to describe it. Xenoblade Chronicles is right there with them, so it's a good one.
Yeah, she always rolls her eyes at me because I like to pretend I'm like the old Southern man or whatever when she's playing like these really obscure or these very Japanese games. I'm like, who are these Chinese boys that you're playing with? Things like that. She just like rolls her eyes.
Gene loves the last line of Clive basically in the Ultima fight. I really do love that they just have him say, "We've got a god to kill." I was like, "Yep, there we go, Final Fantasy."
Yep,
that's Final Fantasy in a nutshell. That's absolutely Final Fantasy.
Who are those little Korean boys on the screen that you're playing with? All right, my friend.
Well, the thing about Xenoblade is that they're all British too. And
I noticed that because she's playing it.
A lot of the same actors in Final Fantasy are also in Xenoblade, including Ultima's voice actor, who is also the same voice actor for the final boss in Xenoblade 3.
Interesting. He's like typecast. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, guys, I thank you for taking the time. We went a little long here, but I don't mind. I think we all recommend Final Fantasy 16, available on PS5, digitally and physically. Definitely check it out. I think Square Enix deserves a lot of credit for this game, and shout out to Sony for, I guess, helping fund it or doing something to help it along its way. So I guess we should get them.
Jim Ryan's name was in credits.
I saw that actually. Yeah.
I was like, this game's never fucking coming to Xbox. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I would be interested to know, like, my theory on. I have so many theories because we don't know exactly what the deal is for these Final Fantasy games, but you would imagine that it could be something like, you don't sell it anywhere else and your cut is 85-15 on every.
I really don't think the deals have to be very interesting, honestly. I mean, PlayStation has the bigger base, and the feeling I've gotten on this is that Square didn't love its returns from the big Final Fantasy 13 push on the Microsoft side. So I don't know that you need a lot of convincing at the
or 15
negotiating table
either, you know? I mean, people keep comparing the sales from 15 to 13, 15 and 16, but most of the sales for 15 was on PlayStation. You know, no one's fucking buying Final Fantasy on Xbox.
Well, I mean, I am, because I think the 15 like glow up has been good on the Xbox compatibility side, but I didn't play it first there, so that's certainly true.
Yeah, it'll be. I forgot that 13 migrated over, and it's. Yeah, I just I'm always interested in what the deal would be, because I think people assume it's like, it's probably marketing dollars for sure, but some people assume it's like upfront money. And I'm like, I bet you it isn't. I bet you that sometimes is true, but I bet you it's just better cuts, right? Like much substantially better cuts than you would otherwise get. And
I just don't think, I agree with you. I just don't think you need a lot of sweetener in order to convince a JRPG company to stick with Sony.
I think so too.
Yeah, I agree.
You're right.
Well said. All right, let's get the hell out of here. Thank you guys. Appreciate you. Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things Sacred Symbols. Last Stand Media, you know the drill. Couldn't do without you on Patreon. LastStandMedia.store for merch. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.